There's enough room here. It's okay. Time no see. It's been a while. Not too bad yourself. All the other events you're doing.
We're going to start in about 5 minutes, everyone, so grab yourself a drink and get yourself seated. 5 more minutes till we start.
Here we go.
Get you there. I just keep you sound. Check, check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check.
Okay. Check, 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 check.
You gonna shut me off?
Hello, Fiona. Can you hear us? Perfect. Yeah, we can hear you just fine. All right. Well, thank you kindly. We'll contact you at 1:15.
Ladies and gentlemen, does the sound okay in the back? Good? Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, welcome to everybody to the very first Global First Nations Carbon Summit. It's nice to see the room filling up bit by bit, and thank you so much for attending, for having this become a priority, and for helping this first summit become successful. This is a big day for all of us here, not just the team who helped to pull this together, but of course those of you in line and in the room who made space to learn, to network and share in the important and sometimes hard conversations we're about to have. I'm Lionel Kambeitz, and I'm wearing many hats here today. I'll be your MC today, and I'm also the executive chairman and founder of Carbon RX, the presenting sponsor of the event. A serial entrepreneur I am, and most of all, I'm a champion for the topic of First Nations, environmental sovereignty, and economic empowerment of First Nations lands. I'd like to recognize that we are on Treaty 4 territory, home of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux and Cree, and home of the Métis people. I would also like to recognize the many elected First Nations chiefs and councillors who are here. Too many to signal out all of you individually, but thank you so much for your attendance and for your leadership. So thank you very much. I also at this time think it appropriate to welcome Elder Garnet Woodhouse from Fisher River, 2 hours north of Winnipeg, to say to the stage, to say a few words and maybe set the stage for today's event. Elder Garnet. Right there. Thank you, Elder.
Good afternoon. First of all, I have to correct the MC. I'm from Fairford, not Fish River. But anyways, it's nice to see a lot of people coming to the tables. And I was informed we have a lot of presenters that we'll be listening to this afternoon to gain more about carbon. Because in this country we're living, this land, that's needed to understand each other from all levels, all directions. And that way we to work in unity with respect, understanding, and to encourage each other every day if we want to move forward. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge this Treaty 2 for land that we're here. You know, I've seen a lot of chiefs here, but I do not know most of them. I'm from Manitoba, 3 hours north of Winnipeg. And the First Nation is Penemwodang First Nation. I was a chief for 18 years. I just lost election in last November. In total, I was in politics for 32 years. But being in politics for that long, I gain a lot from expertise, from the grassroots people, from my colleagues, the chiefs, across Canada. That's where I'm coming from. I have 5 kids, 4 boys and 1 girl. My youngest girl is, maybe some of you know her. Her name is Cindy Woodhouse Nipanag. She's the original chief for Manitoba. She's the youngest in the family, and I'm proud of her. I thank God every day for her, praying for her to be there for what she's doing. But I just want to make those remarks before we do an opening prayer. But I also like to thank all the engineers, the expertise that are here with us today. I'm really honored and humbled to stand before you, being asked to say a prayer. But I'm a believer, you know, because the way I pray, sure we talk to the Lord from different angles, different ways of beliefs, but I never undermine any other belief, because we all talk to the one, the reason why we're here. He gave us an opportunity. You know, he died for us. He gave us an opportunity, to work together in this land, to make the best out of it, and to protect it. That's my belief. We went through a lot. Our First Nation went through a lot of difficulties. But we're here today, to give each other strength and to educate each other as we go along. Then we can understand each other, the steps that's needed to take place after this meeting today. And I'm really honored to be part of this meeting this afternoon. And I see a lot of smiling faces out there, which is good. We'll make a way. We'll move forward. Because there's a lot of issues. We hear about this a lot, about carbon. But talking about it will never move forward. But we have to collectively gain that and how we can move forward. And that's the key, I believe, in this gathering this afternoon. And also, I'd like to encourage everyone. Keep on. Even at times, there'll be a question, maybe a different view when we move forward from an odd time like that. It happens. But we have to, that's why I'm saying the key is to educate each other, to share the precious moments together, to understand each other, where we're coming from. Because I myself, where I'm coming from, in Manitoba, there's much needed information and explanation and presentation that's needed about carbon. And I'm glad that this year I came here today. What I will be gathered here today, I'll take it back. I've been working for so many leadership out there still today that I will be sharing the moments that I'll be here today. And it's not easy sometimes to move forward. But with your expertise being involved collectively, it'll happen. And I guarantee you that. I guess that's the purpose. So I thank you for listening. So we're gonna pray. Maybe I can ask everyone to stand. Thank you, Lord, for this afternoon, Lord, that we're here in Treaty 4 territory. Thank you, Lord, that you made a way for us today to be here. Bless everyone that's here, Lord. Give us guidance, give us understanding, give us wisdom as the days goes by, Lord. Even I pray for the presenters, Lord, that will be presenting their expertise and to gain something from that, to take it back home and to carry on the path where we want we want to go with this, Lord Jesus. It's for the land that you gave us, to respect it, to cherish it, and to honor it. And I thank you for all the chiefs that are here, the presenters, and also I thank you in overall for being here for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder. Thank you, Elder Woodhouse. Today's program is being shared around the world. We have speakers dialing in from distant time zones. The miracle of technology has allowed us today to have a true global event. I'm told we have people dialing in from Europe, the UAE, United States, across Canada, South America, and India. For those watching online, if you have questions throughout the day, feel free to post them in the chat room, and we'll bring those questions forward. For those of you in the room, please write down your questions on the paper, hold them up, and our team of runners will assemble them, and we'll do our best to accommodate the questions as they come in. I'd like to take this time to introduce to you my co-MC and the Chief Operating Officer of Carbon RX, Marty Seymour. Marty is the Chief Operating Officer. You'll recognize him as a champion of Canadian agriculture. And as he likes to say, I'm a grounded farm kid, and he is, with a history of economic development activity with First Nations. Marty is the heart and soul of this initiative and brings humility, energy, respect, and great skill in having people pull together and come together to meet the mission. Marty's going to interview several of our international guests as part of our program today and work with me on some color commentary after each session. Hope we are all excited about the day as we are. Marty?
All right, thanks, Lionel. Okay, we actually have one of our guests online. So I'm going to keep my remarks a little bit brief, but I want to just start by there we go. That sounds better. For those of you at the back that wouldn't have heard, we have our first guest dialing in from Brussels here. She's online, and I'm going to keep my opening remarks a little bit brief to accommodate her remoteness. But I want to start by recognizing Lionel because he undersells himself a lot. But this conference and the genesis of this has been 15 years in the making, and his thought leadership to bring this concept forward and say, you guys go and do this, turned out to be today with this room that is, for those of you dialing in online, I wish you could be here just to see the audience, feel the energy, and the diversity. We have people here from Ontario through to Northern Alberta, and of course everything in between. So I'd like to, I'll maybe before I we load Fiona here live, I'll take a second to recognize the sponsors because the conference might start with an idea in a boardroom, but doesn't happen without our sponsors. And so I'll draw your attention to our screens. Delta Clean Tech, TP was instrumental in helping get people here to the event today. Economic Development Regina, TD's on our panel. We have Cotecna, you're going to hear from them later. First Nations Power Authority, Above Foods, the Natural Resource Center of Excellence, of course the Regina Chamber, and Ducks Unlimited. And Ducks have a booth over this side. I'd encourage you, if you're in the room, to go say hello to those folks too. They're also very interested in our land and what it stands for and the opportunity that it presents. So I'd like to queue up our first speaker here, Fiona Wild. Now, Fiona's come to us today, to Lionel's point, this is an international event. She is in Belgium, and her and I had a very great conversation yesterday. She was walking down one of the nicest cities in Europe, I'm convinced, is Bruges. And welcome, Fiona. Hopefully you can see us. For those, if you can't see the room, we have 100 people in the room here that are all staring intently at your photo, just off to my right and to my left. So you can speak as if we are all in your living room here having a conversation. Now, Fiona.
Thank you, Monty.
Yeah, great. Welcome, Fiona. Fiona is the VP of Sustainability for BHP. And in Saskatchewan, we would know BHP because of their mine. That's not the Jansen mine that's been such a centerpiece of potash exploration here. But she has a global assignment. She lives in Melbourne, but her accent is not Australian. She informed me yesterday that she's actually UK-born, I believe, is what our conversation was. But she has a direct connection to Saskatchewan. Fiona, maybe I'll cue you up to tell us about your direct link to Saskatchewan.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Marty, for inviting me. And sorry for being in a hotel room in Brussels. Normally I am in Melbourne, but as you might be able to tell from my accent, I am from the UK originally. My connection with Saskatchewan is it goes back about 80 years now. So my mum was actually, she was born in the UK, and during the Second World War, she was fortunate enough to be evacuated from the north of England to Regina. So I have relatives and friends in Regina, and I have a really strong sense of gratitude to the people of Saskatchewan for keeping my family and my mum safe. So thank you very much for the value of that contribution that you made to my family personally. It's much appreciated.
All right, well, welcome, Fiona. Now, we have 15 minutes here, and you and I had talked about a couple really important things that you wanted to share with the group here. Now, the first one is as it relates to decarbonization. And I'm a layperson from Saskatchewan, and I think about a global mining company being net zero. I don't even understand how it's possible, Fiona. Help me see our way through this.
It is a really tricky challenge. And so when we're thinking about making commitments to reduce emissions, we have to think about where those emissions come from and what actions we can put in place to reduce them. When you think about mining companies like BHP, generally speaking, our emissions come from 3 different places. So they come from the electricity that we consume, they come from the diesel that we burn in trucks, and then they tend to come from things what we call fugitive emissions, which are other types of emissions often associated with, for example, coal mining. So when we're thinking about emissions, we need to understand where it makes the most sense to focus in the first instance, and then how we would progress emission reductions over time. Broadly speaking, around the world for BHP, the first place we go to is around electricity and where we source our electricity. So you would have seen a big shift in the way that BHP sources electricity over the last few years. We've significantly shifted from coal-fired and gas-fired power to renewables. And that has a issue there is that we're using trucks which are really, really large. And so you can't buy trucks off the shelf. Well, not off the shelf. You can't buy trucks that are actually large enough at the moment to replace those mechanical drive trucks or diesel-driven trucks that we use at the moment. So what we have to do there is about working in packs. So working with Caterpillar and Komatsu and others to make sure that when we need to buy the next generation of trucks, we can actually buy electric drive trucks. And that's a really complicated proposition because those trucks aren't available now, but also we have to start thinking how would we charge them and make sure that we continue to have, for example, 24-hour operations at our mines. So there's some practical limitations around how we can shift over to electric drive trucks, even beyond making sure these things are available when we need to buy them. The third area is around what we call fugitive emissions. And as I mentioned, these are largely associated with emissions associated with coal mining, for example, and some of the methane gas that can be produced when we're producing coal. And there it's really about thinking through research and development and new technologies to capture that methane when it's released. So when you're thinking about decarbonising mining, it's about electricity, and then it's about trucks, and then it's about what you might call residual emissions. But we've set a goal to get to net zero by 2050. We've got a clear path to reduce our emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And currently, I'm glad to say, we're ahead of schedule.
Oh, well, that's a good way to end that statement, actually. And so I think I also heard that in order to hit your net zero, do you need to buy carbon offsets then, or are you going to achieve this in your own internal mechanisms?
We're trying to achieve this, what we call real structural abatement, which is a kind of legalistic way of just saying reducing emissions permanently. So what we'd like to focus on is changing the way we operate so that these emissions are just not produced, so we don't need to utilize offsets. Challenging thing is that when you look at the opportunities to reduce emissions, they get harder over time. So as I mentioned, changing coal and gas-fired power to renewables is relatively straightforward in most locations around the world. Thinking through shifting from diesel-powered trucks to electric trucks, we can start to see how we can work with manufacturers to get those trucks available, probably towards the late 2020s, early 2030s. But for some of the other emissions, we can't yet see a pathway to reduce emissions completely. So what we need to think about is the role of offset going forward. So we're not going to use offsets as an excuse to delay emissions reductions because we want to actually deliver real sustainable reductions. We might need to use offsets as we get towards 2050 if there are emissions that we can't reduce because there aren't technological solutions available. And really that's why companies and countries talk about net zero rather than absolute zero, because it's a recognition that there are some emissions that are really hard to reduce, but there are some emissions that are easier, and you can actually create offsets from working harder in some sectors than others. And so when you're thinking about the use of offsets, you want to make sure that not only do they have credibility in terms of reducing carbon, but also that they can generate other types of co-benefits. So for example, community development opportunities or environment and biodiversity benefits. So offsets, in a sense, are a last port of call, but when you're utilizing offsets, you want to make sure that you're using the absolute best quality that can give you these sort of community and environment co-benefits.
Okay, you know about the involvement of Indigenous communities. I think you had an example out of Australia that might apply here, but I wonder if your thoughts, our room here is a mix of First Nations people from across Canada, but you also have a global mindset. So where do Indigenous people fit in?
It's a really interesting question. Must be really critical partners for BHP. The reality is that many or most of our operated assets are located on or near lands or territory that are traditionally owned or under the customary use of Indigenous peoples. So we engage with Indigenous peoples to understand their environmental, their social and their cultural development priorities, because we want to ensure that those Indigenous peoples benefit from our presence over the long term. So we consider their views as we progress through every stage of development. And what we're increasingly saying this isn't about resources companies thinking through the outcomes they want to achieve and influencing or encouraging others to come with them. It's about co-creation of solutions. And that involves companies like BHP being prepared to step back and recognize that we don't have the answers. And things may take longer than we'd expected. And we may not always know what the outcome's going to be. But those co-created solutions are the ones that actually value for all of the different shareholders and stakeholders who are involved. In terms of carbon management, there really are opportunities already for us to work with Indigenous peoples, particularly in terms of how we improve environmental outcomes and these community outcomes I mentioned earlier on. So a couple of examples I'll give you. We have a mine site in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, the Yandi mine, and we developed an Indigenous-led site rehabilitation program. So it's looking at how we can rehabilitate the land that previously been mined. And we've worked with the local Indigenous people, the Banjima people, to develop an organisation that is focused on native seed growth and planting. And that Banjima are now expected to be planting around 20,000 trees over the next 5 years. And what it's doing is it's bringing the Banjima into the local workforce, and it's providing a really sustainable solution for those individuals, as well as driving fantastic environmental outcomes for the site. Another example through our BHP Foundation, we've got a program called the 10 Deserts Project, and that's actually in bringing about Indigenous land management of around 35% of Australia's land mass, which, as you would know, is huge. And what it does, it supports ongoing expansion of an Indigenous Rangers program. So this incredible understanding of the natural environment and how land can be best managed is really, really valuable to miners, and you'll find that we're starting to recognise that and value that far more now than we ever have before.
Okay, my last question. We have just a couple minutes left. I'm always interested in the future. So you've obviously been living the world of sustainability and carbon, et cetera. If you fast forwarded 10 years out, what will we be talking about, or what do we need to be talking about today to make sure we're ready for 10 years out?
Good question. Things are moving really fast. So I used to think that I kind of would have to start thinking maybe sort of 2 or 3 years ahead. What I'm finding at the moment is things are moving so fast that the things that you expect today can sometimes be out of date in a month or 2 months even. So the pace of change that we're seeing is really fast. But I think one of the underlying themes that we're seeing is this interconnection between climate change and biodiversity. So we're seeing biodiversity and climate change, or biodiversity loss and climate change, really amplifying the sensitivity of natural systems. And what you're starting to see is companies thinking a lot more about how to address these twin crises of climate and biodiversity loss. So you start to see companies thinking about things like nature positivity. And what that really means is making sure that what you're aiming for is a future of nature. So that might be around biodiversity, ecosystem services, natural capital, which is greater than the current state. So creating positive benefit. What that means is, though, we have to start valuing nature. So one of the best ways to encourage companies like BHP and others to really think about the impacts of our activities on nature is to put a value on nature. And we're doing a lot of work now in terms of natural capital accounting, which is up a natural value on nature, which enables it to compete and win against other forms of financial value. And that is one of the most important things you can do. And also, I think one of the most important things you'll start to see permeating through. In the same way that carbon pricing or pricing of carbon is becoming more recognized, I think broadening that out to think about the value of nature and the criticality of the ecosystems that we operate within, once that can be really valued alongside conventional ways of thinking about financial value, you'll start to see real sustainable value being delivered through companies like BHP in collaboration with their communities.
Oh, thank you for that. Actually, you really set us up for a panel coming up here in about 30 minutes on ESGs and how we measure, manage, whether we can monetize this or should we monetize it. So, Fiona, I respect that it's late in the night there. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us. As an appreciation of your time, we are going to get in your hands this book, Indigenomics, and our keynote speaker later today, Caroline Hilton, wrote this book, and I think you'd really appreciate it. It's a great read. So. Thank you again, Fiona, for joining us, and please join me in thanking Fiona.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Have a great conversation.
Marty, thank you very much for that. A few key takeaways between you and I on this. First of all, we're so fortunate to have BHP Billiton as a significant corporate citizen in Saskatchewan. They've stayed the line, they've held the course, and they seem to be talking the talk and walking the talk and making this work. But really, at the end of the day as well, we're going to start asking some of our corporate leaders how they feel about buying carbon credits and taking carbon credits to meet their net 2050, their net zero 2050s. How do they feel about applying social license to that carbon credit as well? I think we're going to start having that conversation through the piece, because every one of these corporations has a very specific mandate to social license and the social license issues that are important to them. And I think the concept of combining an environmental bona fide voluntary carbon credit and a social license issues really go hand in hand. So I think that's the challenge that we're going to have to start pushing back, is what we're going to have to do.
Thanks, Lionel. And maybe my last thoughts on what Fiona shared. This nature positivity piece that she introduced us to here, for those of you in the land that are the rights holders of the land, this is exactly what we've been talking about, is the idea that they're putting true value and true meaning on how we use our land. So yeah, thanks again to Fiona, Lionel, great comments as well. I completely agree. While we queue up our next speaker, are we good on the Zoom? All right, so Parker's over there on AV working double time behind the scenes to try to coordinate all this. And welcome, Honorable Bob Rae. We can see you on screen here now, and I'm just going to give a couple opening remarks, and really looking forward to this next 30 minutes we have together. So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with Bob Rae was the former Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995. But his current assignment right now is he's the Canadian ambassador to the UN, and he's calling from New York today. And once again, the Global First Nations Carbon Summit wouldn't be complete without global presence. So welcome, Bob. Bob was the interim leader of the Liberal Party 2011 to 2013. And Bob, I actually saw a legal agreement come by my desk here a few days ago from OKT Law, and I understand that you have some history with OKT Law as well. So Bob has been around Indigenous issues and Indigenous conversations for a long time, and he brings today some thoughts and perspectives from the UN. And so, Bob, my last comment would be that you and I actually have something in common, which I did a little homework on and figured this out, is we both did the Rick Mercer report once in our day. And if you have not seen Bob's Rick Mercer segment about, I don't know, 2012, Bob? Does that sound right?
No, I did two of them. I've actually done a few, but the one I think you're probably referring to was in 2005, I think, 2006.
Okay. You went fishing with Rick. Yeah, so it's a must-watch. I can't give away the ending. It's probably my favorite Mercer report of all time. Bob, hands down for you for being a good sport. And if you guys know Rick, you'll know that he took advantage of Bob's sense of humor too. So welcome, Ambassador. Thanks for joining us today. And Ambassador and I agreed to just do a little bit of kind of podcast-style conversation here. And Ambassador, I think a place to start would be, what's on the UN's agenda. I'm a small town farm kid from Saskatchewan. I'm still not totally clear what the UN is up to on a day-to-day basis, or even how it fits into my local world. But what's keeping you up at night over there at the UN?
Well, the UN, first of all, the UN each year around. The yearly schedule starts in September, so now we're at the beginning of another year. The first thing that happens, the opening of the year is 10 days of meetings, officials coming in from all over the world, including our Prime Minister, our Minister of the Environment, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of International Development. They were all with us for the first few days, and that was a very lively time, because you have all kinds of, think of it as sort of like a big conference where you've got a lot of people meeting and a lot of side meetings and a lot of conversations, and of course with the technologies that we have now, people that are coming in by a whole variety of means. I think you'd have to say there's probably 5 or 6 big things happening this year, right now. The first is the issue that's being caused by all the other issues, which is a significant global downturn, lots of signs, indications of serious challenges for the global economy, interest rates going up, demand going down, production going down, trade flatlining and in some cases diminishing, and that will in itself trigger a whole bunch of other things that will happen to countries that are impacted by a slowdown of the global economy, and we have no idea any more than anybody else does how bad this is going to get. But we think that it's serious. A lot of people think it's really serious. It's actually quite significant. The number of countries that have very high debts and that are already in rough shape and bad shape, so that's going to be affected. Second big issue, climate change, is with us very much on the agenda, on the table. We're going to have a big meeting in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt at the end of November. That'll be another major focus point, as well as the Biodiversity Summit, which is taking place in Montreal, and is environment, global various issues. Pandemic is still with us, so the pandemic and its impacts, reverberations, how do we share vaccines better, how do we share treatments better, how do we make sure that the world doesn't face something like this again, and finally the conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, the most serious, Russia and Ukraine, but it's the climate change and the pandemic that have all contributed to the economic crisis. So when you say you're a kid in Saskatchewan, you're not quite sure what we all do or what the impacts will be. I understand that completely, but the fact remains that what happens in the rest of the world has a big impact on Saskatchewan. There will probably be a higher demand for Saskatchewan's agricultural production for wheat. There will be a higher demand for potash, because potash, as you know, makes fertilizer. But there will be also some significant challenges that will arise out of much higher interest rates and what that could do to people's incomes and people's jobs. So that all these things are interconnected.
So maybe to build off that, Ambassador, I'm thinking about your comments on economy, Ukraine, and in particular energy. I mean, a lot of the room that you're speaking to today, Western Canadians, maybe trying to better understand the implication of the war, where energy's headed, and your thoughts, because you're looking at this from such a macro level, and maybe the conversation you have with other countries that want to buy Canadian things, whether it's energy or food, really. I have no perspective on what it's like at a very high level in senior government.
Well, I think the energy challenges, as I see it, is this, and I'm giving a bit of a personal take, a bit of a personal sort of sentiment. we're roughly 2% of the global economy, a little more than that, but not much. And the global economy is worth about $100 trillion, U.S. dollars, a year back. We passed the 100 trillion mark in the global economy, GDP. We made a decision as a country back in the 90s that we would join in the international effort to reduce carbon emissions, to put it in its simplest form. We're a big carbon producer. Per capita, we're a relatively large emitter, big distances, cold weather, resource-based economy, all the reason that's the case. And at the same time, we are not a big emitter in absolute terms because we're such a small population, and so what we do, we could shut off tomorrow, if we were to shut off tomorrow, all of our carbon emissions, stop driving our cars, stop using gas to heat our homes, you go down the list of all the things we do. If we were to stop, it would have very, very little impact on the global situation. And that, I think, is something that's really important for Canadians to understand. We're not a big emitter. The reason that is important for us to join in this international effort is I think there's a general agreement, although there's always going to be dissenting voices, to say that carbon emissions stay in the atmosphere for a long time. They have for the last 350 years. As they accumulate, they change the climate. They have the impacts of changing the climate. And that's not good because things get a lot hotter, things get a lot colder, water level rise, ice melts, all the things we know about, droughts, more floods, more violent weather one way or the other. This is not a good thing. We've got to try to reduce the level of emissions. Canada's not a leader in this regard. We sometimes the rhetoric doesn't make you think that we are, but the reality is that other major emitters, particularly the three big blocks, China, Asia, the United States, North America, and Europe, and the rapidly growing emitters are, of course, in Asia. In the rapidly industrialized world, Africa's relatively speaking a very small emitter per population, extremely populated. The fact is that unless we have a credible approach to what we're trying to do and how we're doing it, we'll have very little influence over what will happen globally. I think it's also fair to say that there was, I think, a thought which is misplaced and wrong, the idea. I think that the process of dealing with emissions will be just sort of a gradual bending of a curve. But the reality is, that we've seen in many other fields, is that it's not that easy. It's not that simple. There's a lot of bumps and ups and downs along the way. And I think we're seeing that now. We saw it in 2008 with the financial crisis. We're seeing it again now. And we're seeing a general public opinion. How far can you go to keep people on side? If the impact that people feel is simply that prices go up and they have to pay more, so the cost of living becomes much higher. And that tends to make people unhappy. It tends to put pressure on governments and tends to create a very active political situation. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a time when publics around the world are very, very engaged in trying to figure out how to deal with questions of access and questions of price. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I want to come back to China in a minute, but first, you brought up 2008. It was actually one of the questions I had thought about first. What's different this time is if I think back to the first generation of, we come out of Kyoto, everyone was going to go out and try super hard, reduce their carbon emissions, and then the financial crisis hit. We kind of tabled those ambitions. But it feels different to me today around the active conversations around carbon management and mitigation. And I'm interested from your standpoint of going through that transition, you know, what's different this time?
Well, we're not quite sure how different it's going to be. I think that the political pressures are certainly different. I think there's a wider acceptance today than there was 20 years ago, or 12 years ago, that climate change is real. I think increasingly people are feeling that climate change is not a future issue, not a future problem. It's not my grandchildren's problem. It's my problem. We're seeing that by the linkage between dramatic weather events and the production of carbon emissions. Now, what I said we don't really know, I think it's also fair to say that there's a lot of countries that had plans and still have plans to move from coal to natural gas, or from natural gas and coal to renewables, whatever the combination we need, but to get with program of reducing emissions, which you can only do by changing how you produce electricity, changing how you drive your cars and trucks. And we're seeing signs of that, right? We're seeing more electric cars, some electric trucks come on the market. We're seeing a change in technology. We're seeing a lot more solar, a lot more wind, a lot more other ways of getting stuff on the grid. So we see the impact we have. But you got to understand, China is still producing a lot of its electricity from coal, and coal is the most carbon inefficient fuel. And so when you say it looks like it feels different, it feels different, it does feel different, but whether that produces the kind of change in numbers that we're always looking for remains to be seen. During the pandemic, we used to hear the talk, a lot of people talked about bending the curve, right? We want to bend the level of incidence of COVID so we can keep our hospitals open, so we can make sure that we're getting ahead of the pandemic. We're beginning to use the same language about emissions, but you got to remember, in Canada, most of the provinces have not been able to reduce their emissions, and that's creating a challenge of credibility for governments to say, well, we say we're making all these decisions that we have yet to see the level of emissions come down. And don't forget that the emissions go up. They don't just disappear. The emissions have a way of hanging around. That means that we have a cumulative problem that's built up over a long period of time that's creating the challenge that we now have.
Okay, so let's deal with China then head on. As I always call it the elephant in the room in terms of we think about China, India, big populations, big energy consumers. How's the UN sort of manage their way through that to bring China along at a fast enough pace to actually have a material impact?
Well, they signed the treaty. They've been part of the Kyoto process. And the latest version of Kyoto is the Paris Agreement in 2015. And China is part of that. So China has made commitments. There are countries that would see China go even further. We all would. Because China, as a rapidly industrializing country, is now the world's single emitter on an annual basis. It's not the United States, it's not Europe, it's China. And it will be joined by other countries like India, like Indonesia, like other countries with large populations that are moving to be rapidly industrialized. And there are a number, and we're going to see their emissions go up. So our job is to figure out how do we stop the process of their sticking with coal, and how do we move past coal? And that's something we're looking at all the time.
Let's shift gears a little bit. got a huge constituent dialed in today, listening from across Canada, First Nations communities. We got First Nations leaders in the room here today, and you obviously have lots of background in this space. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, looking over the fence from New York at the Canadian, influencers in this, say, nature-based carbon space. How do First Nations people play in this category? Do you have advice for them as leaders? Yeah.
For 5 years, I was very heavily involved in the Ottawa negotiations and also the negotiations in British Columbia. So between, actually, more like 20 before I took this job on full time. I spent a lot of time in Ontario, British Columbia, and in northern Saskatchewan, elsewhere, talking to First Nations and helping them, trying to help give them advice, not legal advice, basically, in terms of what were their rights, and how could they influence the development of public policy in Canada. We now have the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canadians were very much involved in negotiating. And that basically says that First Nations require free traditional territories. And that's the law internationally. I also believe that the principles of the law in Canada. I learned in the process of giving advice that as an outsider, you have to be very careful about giving advice. First Nations are going to make up their own minds as to what they want and how they want to do it. I do think that it's not possible today for energy projects or mineral projects or mining projects or other projects to happen without the informed consent of Indigenous people. I don't think it's possible for that to happen legally. I don't think it's possible politically. I don't think it's possible. So it's essential that First Nations know what their rights are and know how they can exercise those rights and appreciate how serious the impact that they can have really is. This is a changed game. This is a changed game now compared to what was before. And it means that First Nations have not only the right to be at the table, but they have a right to decide what will be the pace and what will be the place of development in Canada. They are very much in the driver's seat.
Maybe focus my last question on something I love to ask leaders. And you clearly have a great pedigree of leadership. And this is that advice you'd give your younger self. If you looked in the rearview mirror, your whole political career, and the many rooms you've been in, what would you have told yourself, your 20-year-old self?
If I don't have any regrets, I would say take your time. I got into things pretty early. I was elected to the forum when I was very young. I was a fairly driven person, but I think I would have said, smell flowers a bit, enjoy it. Not that I haven't enjoyed myself, and I'm very blessed with 3 children, and my wife and I have 6 grandchildren, so we feel that's become an increasingly important part of our lives. I think the other thing I would say is don't be too sure of yourself. Remember that you can be wrong, you can make mistakes, and you will make mistakes, don't be wrong. And it's very important to remember that. I think when you're younger, you tend to be looking for perfection and you tend to be very judgeful about things that fall short of that. I hope I've learned not to be quite that sure myself. Or now is easy, more self-deprecating, if you like, just be easy to myself. And I'll always remember the thing that I've learned in my life through good and bad times is the most important thing is love. Love is the most important thing. I've been very lucky to have been loved and to have been able to love, and that's more than anything else. It's way more important than this interview.
I think I want to give you last word on that. Well said. And I want to hang on one thing you did say that I didn't expect to hear at a carbon summit is the word love. It just didn't strike me that would find its way in. But Ambassador, thanks for your time today. You know, as an appreciation gift, we wanted to send you this book. I don't know if you can see it in the shot, but it's Indigenomics, drafted by Caroline Hilton, and it's an appreciation for what you did today to give us your time. You're one of the busiest people that I've ever come across. So thanks again.
And spent last week reflecting a lot on the 30th of September, and I still think there's a journey we all have to go on together. It involves telling the truth, but really involves learning how to respect each other, and if I may say so once again, learning how to love each other. I think is something we keep having to do. It's going to. It's a good journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Ambassador Ray, pardon me. I think there's Ambassador Ray, I watched one of his lectures 13 years ago at the University of Regina on a cold evening, and there was a lecture series on, and he was speaking on Indigenous economics, the economic development of First Nations and some of the impediments to that. He's learned, he knows the subject, and my takeaway from that is first of all, I'm optimistic when someone representing Canada, our country, has that kind of experience. That's a great outcome from this, Marty, that you sort of realize that we have somebody on the file that really knows how to get the job done for us and understands all the issues that are in front of us as well. I think as well his comment on China is important. The fact that we like to say that they're the largest emitters, they're not complying. We hear all of the negativity, which is fine. But the fact remains is that they did sign up for Paris. They are part of the agreement, which is very, very important to recognize. That's always encouraging. And remember, you know, there's still 50 million people in China who don't even have electricity yet. So when we think about the development of a society and the development of an economy, certainly I'm always encouraged to hear that. Marty, I'm going to read a letter that we received. We received it earlier, but we just didn't have an opportunity to properly open it up, addressed to you and I. And it's from one of our former prime ministers, the Right Honorable Jean Chrétien. And he goes on to say, Martin and Lionel, I am pleased to address participants and organizers of this inaugural Global First Nations Carbon Summit. As we have seen in recent days, the effects of climate change can be devastating. Our response to climate change is imperative. I commend the efforts of those gathered here today in seeking and developing needed carbon reduction strategies. Canada has emerged as one of the leaders in the clean energy technologies field. This inaugural summit brings together the leaders of the Indigenous business community, the clean energy industry, and leaders of traditional knowledge, taking Canadian success to the next level. I wish you the best in your deliberations and look forward to the outcomes and the recommendations from this summit. The Honourable Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister of Canada. Well, thank you, Mr. Chrétien, and we appreciate the fact that he's been participating in the First Nations file in a very, very meaningful and significant way throughout most of his political life. Our next panel will be led by Pat Fiacco, the Business Development Manager for Carbon RX, based right here in Saskatchewan. Pat has served as the Mayor of Regina previously for 12 years, and I can say has built a reputation for Indigenous inclusion. Of course, the locals will know that he spearheaded the I Love Regina Day, and we always enjoyed the enthusiasm that Pat brought to the office. He's done the same thing in terms of understanding the importance of bringing together 150 million acres of First Nations land to be able to represent the largest force in climate change and climate change reduction in North America and perhaps even in the world. I want to say as well that after politics, Pat started his own company, the Fiacco Management Group, which focused on the economic development of First Nations. So he has great learnings in terms of First Nations economic development, and these learnings about how to bring people together. With that, I'd like to have Pat Fiacco come to the stage.
Okay, we're on. Yeah, and can you turn the main mic off on the podium? Because I think there's some feedback. Need a step from a... Tells you why I didn't have a successful basketball career. Hello? Okay, we're good. Well, thank you very much, Lionel. I'm going to be introducing a couple of gentlemen that are going to be on the panel here. I'll start off with Jason Rasevych. Jason is a partner at Deloitte Canada and national leader of the Indigenous Services team. Jason Rasevych is a Anishinaabe from Indigenomics, First Nation, and partner at Deloitte Canada. Jason is the national leader of the Indigenous Services team and leads Deloitte's Indigenous Wealth Management service line, which works to support First Nations and trustees in managing approximately $1 billion in investment funds. Jason's knowledge of economic development on First Nations will strengthen this discussion that we're going to have on ESG investing. So please give a warm applause to Jason. Andrew, come on up. You don't need something you can, he's tall, isn't he? Andrew Hall is the managing director of Carbon Markets Advisory, Sustainable Finance and Corporate Transitions and TD Services or Securities. Andrew has over 15 years of experience in environmental commodities, helping build out successful businesses within the financial services and energy sectors. Prior to joining TD, Andrew was responsible for sustainable finance strategy, products and platforms at TMX Group and led the North American environmental commodities business at Capital Power. Please welcome Andrew Hall. Before we get started on the discussion, I do want to introduce our former Speaker of the House at the Saskatchewan Legislature. He's a current sitting MLA with the provincial government Sask Party. Please give a welcome to Mark Docherty. Thanks for being here, Mark. So let's get started, gentlemen. Are we ready? And I'll ask each of you this question. And the first one is, can you tell me what ESG investing means in the industry that you're in today?
Sure. Test.
Yeah, I think you're on.
Okay. Yeah, the industry for ESG, there's some trends that are happening, and some of it is being established through legislative drivers related to nature-based carbon solutions. I'll focus more of my points on nature-based carbon solutions and maybe specifically some key pointers with carbon. But there are companies now and investors that are taking the socially responsible investment route and looking at where investments are being supported by First Nations communities. And this is very important to the concept of sustainable finance, to reducing risk in the investment portfolio that companies are looking at. And it also is influencing the investment policy related to how these investments are being made. Hearing Bob Ray speak, I recall working with him a number of years, within the Matawa file and project, and that's come a long way with UNDRIP. But I also acknowledge comments that are being made by leaders regarding UNDRIP and FPIC, and going back to honoring the foundations of the treaties. When I think of bringing it back to setting the tone on ESG, I've heard leaders say, sure, we've got some legislative drivers there to have some discussions on, be able to advance some of the concepts of ESG and UNDRIP and FPIC, but there are nations that have a nation-to-nation agreement based on treaty, and that acknowledgement should also be discussed. My nation, Gunuguming, is signatory James Bay Treaty number 9. I also notice one of my colleagues, Albelina here from Mishkigawak Development Corporation, also in that area. And many of the treaties do have similar types of tones or language related to land restoration or land preservation and protecting of First Nation rights, First Nation ancestral inherent rights and responsibilities. And part of that is an evergreen statement, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. When treaties were signed, we didn't think we'd have the discussion on the air, on the carbon, but it does have impacts related to nations. And many of the issues that we see today regarding barriers to advancing First Nations positions in the carbon offsets are due to jurisdiction, are due to lands, rights, and title. And the more opportunity to, I guess we'll get into some of that discussion on some recommendations later on in this segment, but the more that First Nations are raising awareness, are educating their own communities, and also developing positions on where they stand related to nature-based climate solutions is very important to do. So to circle back to the question, it has major impacts on investors, lenders, First Nations as potential suppliers, and also the buyers across corporate Canada that are responding to climate change disclosures, also Indigenous relations disclosures, which are going to be a point in the future related to response to certain policies they may have into place around those treaties or around FPIC or UNDRIP, and how companies could do a better job to work in collaboration with nations and in advancing carbon or nature-based climate solutions.
Thanks, Jason. And Andrew, again, ESG investing in your industry, what does that mean?
Sure. Thanks, Pat, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all here today about carbon markets. I mean, ESG broadly thought of as an umbrella term under which carbon markets and carbon offsets sit, touches every single part of the capital markets and financial markets. At this point, you'll be very hard-pressed to find large institutional investors and increasingly smaller investors down to the retail level that don't take into account some sort of consideration of ESG, and that's not just climate change, that's social and governance. It's not pure ESG altruism or environmental altruism. What they're finding then is incorporating ESG considerations into investment decisions can lead to better performance. I'd say the jury's still out to a certain extent on that, but those are some of the general trends. As it relates to carbon markets, the carbon markets and the development of them has been quite interesting. From my perspective, I've been involved in the market since about 2006. The markets themselves are not new. They're new to a lot of people just because they've gained prominence in the last couple of years, and particularly coming out of the pandemic, but they've been around for over 30 years, particularly the voluntary market, the compliance markets, particularly in EU, which are by far the largest carbon markets right now, compliance carbon market. Then you had ESG investing probably in the last 10 to 12 years. And now what you're seeing is the convergence of ESG investing and the carbon markets. And that convergence is a result of corporates in large part starting to make net zero commitments. So starting to say, hey, we are going to start to put ourselves on that lower carbon trajectory. And typically the easiest and first step that they take to start to get on that trajectory is the use of offsets while they explore longer term, more permanent reductions along the lines of what Fiona from BHP mentioned earlier. And so that's where you're starting to see increasingly investors looking to purchase offsets, corporates looking to purchase offsets, sovereigns. There's 120 sovereigns that have made net zero commitments in line with their Paris Agreement commitments. who are starting to look at the offset market, and as a result, you're seeing investors follow suit, and we're seeing large pools of institutional capital that are looking to invest in the carbon markets in a way that quite simply hasn't been the case in the past, and so it's no longer, before there really just wasn't any money, frankly, and now it's billions from private equity, from sovereign wealth funds, from increasingly public markets that are exploring the carbon markets and starting to place capital in them. One of the interesting areas, I think, for this audience is just the interest in nature-based solutions, which are typically land-based terrestrial offset type projects like forestry and agriculture. So I think when you start to think about the equitable distribution of the benefits from the growth of that market, the traditional stewards of that land, First Nations and such, I think will be key partners as we see that market grow and start to scale.
So you talked a bit about getting First Nations involved into the carbon offset market. Can you be more specific? And I'm gonna ask you the same question, Jason. What are some things that can be done in respect to that?
So as it relates to Canada specifically, right, when you look at land ownership, the vast majority is Crown land. So there's very little private land or privately managed land then that is eligible for the creation of offset projects. And I believe, I don't know the stat, but I believe a large chunk of that is held by First Nations, and therefore as companies are starting to look to forestry projects, for example, really they need to form some sort of partnership with the stewards of those lands in order to deploy the capital to either purchase the land or develop the offset project with those folks.
Thank you. Jason, any further comment on First Nations getting into the carbon offset market?
Yeah, I guess I could build on the first comment on awareness and education and having more dialogue at the community level, perhaps integrating the discussion within the Lands and Resource Department in each of the community, or specifically maybe a councillor that has that portfolio, whether it's in the environmental or lands and resource or in the economic development, but definitely it should be a topic that should be discussed. Communities should be working on planning for the future generations, and part of the challenge that we see with the market that when my colleague explains how long it's been and how mature it is at this point, even though there's some new discoveries related to how we should move forward, is First Nations are somewhat reacting to what's being done, and being more proactive will better position the nations to play a key role, potentially as a supplier, and then building it into new agreements. And if there's opportunity to discuss existing agreements with potential buyers, of having that in the specific chapter related to first right of refusal is important, related to consent for consent-based agreement making when certain companies are coming on First Nations traditional lands, to be able to include certain components of potential providing nature-based climate solutions or that discussion. The other is, of course, asserting jurisdiction. That difficult to do across different provinces that may have a different view on the carbon market or the offset area. We see BC with being more advanced with its offset system. Federally, there's a protocol that's being developed that support a First Nation view on forest management adaptation. But there are certain provinces that are still behind related to supporting some of those development. And then when we think about, well, what about wetlands restoration and so forth, there's challenges there to have a certain criteria in place to be eligible. So the more a nation is bringing this up in the community dialogue, that it's part of the land planning process for the community, and that potentially there's collaboration there amongst overlapping areas, or to work regionally or potential provincially to potentially supply the available carbon that's there, and to have more leverage in some of those discussions. So a few ideas there.
Thank you. Andrew, as far as trends go right now, what trends do you see occurring?
I mean, just a lot of capital flowing into the space, quite simply, and a real focus on, again, nature-based solutions. And as it relates to Canada, forestry is a big one. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first and foremost, it's about, in the case of forestry, but also agriculture, it's about removals. So as the forest grows, it continues to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's important. But the other thing too then is investors are starting to look at co-benefits, which was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions. And co-benefits are, watershed protection. As one example, you've got biodiversity, flora and fauna, and the like, and buyers are increasingly attracted to that, in addition to the actual removals that might take place. There's different types of forestry projects, and there's different types of agricultural products that are out there. But that's where we're seeing, significant capital being, invested in is those types of projects. We ourselves just invested in a forestry project in Ontario. We made the announcement 2 weeks ago, $10 million in partnership with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to invest in the Boreal Wildlands project. That is going to be, it's a 30-year deal that then allows the Conservation Fund to go out and purchase the land and put that into a conservation easement such that it's there in perpetuity, whereas the base case scenario was that would have been sort of industrial forest that would have been logged. It was purchased from a timber company, Domtar. So as one example that we ourselves are part of, that's a big one. And just sort of, as this market grows, it's not simply nature-based solutions. There's other technologies that are out there, particularly energy efficiency, industrial gases. There's cook stoves in developing countries and the like. But sort of a broader mainstreaming of carbon markets, again, in a way then that we just haven't seen. And to be clear, the carbon markets are still minuscule in a $1 trillion global carbon market. 900 million of that is compliance markets, mostly the European Emissions Trading Scheme. The voluntary market's $3 billion, but the growth forecasts just over the last couple of years and going forward are sort of your quintessential hockey stick. So a lot of growth to be expected there, and therein, I think a lot of opportunities for folks in the room that are stewards of the land, and are looking for opportunities to develop a revenue stream from that land that doesn't necessarily involve extractive industries, or is in conjunction with those types of industries.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Jason, you want to add to that?
For trends, yeah, I mentioned the few of the offset market in BC, and then federally. There's also at a macro level, the Corsia agreement, the agreement from the feds, and still some questions there as where is the placement of those? How is there an Indigenous lens on that project to ensure that if there are going to be potentially carbon offsets in the future from that, how nations are going to play a role? Some of the challenges, as was mentioned, is the Crown land issue, private lands issue, land lease issue. And from my upbringing or from my worldview, the comments have always been said, Crown land is not Crown land. There's impacts there. There's far beyond the compliance of duty to consult. There's a stronger requirement now to ensure that nations are driving some of that process related to development. And there's just many challenges in the forest sector when it comes to that across jurisdictions, but we are seeing certain ministries work in collaboration to open the door to forest tenure movement. And also some of the consuming mills now that are going to be required to work in partnership with the nation. So if there are going to be offsets on Crown land, nations should be a part of driving that process and reopening that discussion for an atmosphere's benefit sharing agreement similar to the Great Bear Rainforest out west that could be potentially a model for other Crown land projects and forest management. Few in Ontario being pursued, there's still some challenges there with jurisdiction. And overall, I think with the market or the carbon market environment, it just seems to be too focused on the buyer cherry picking the right the project at the lowest price that meets some of their checklist criteria. So if there's an opportunity for nations to drive a model that disrupts the system, that changes how certain selection processes are made related to projects, then we'll see more projects, more meaningful projects funded rather than the lower cost project that just meets companies' criteria.
Well, on that note, based on that, on that perspective, and then when you take into consideration what we've talked about earlier with the ESG component, how are companies going to be able to capitalize on that in respect to First Nations?
If that related to that model, if there's support for purchasing from nations and nations are able to pool supply of potential carbon offsets, then they're able to then average that price across the system, across a portfolio. And if there's more nations that are involving their carbon offsets in a portfolio, but that price is average, then there'll be a buyer-seller system that could potentially support that same price no matter what the project costs are. So you'll see mainly, well, forest management projects happening or certain offsets where there is a criteria to support that, but there'll be influence to support other wetland restoration or habitat for communities that go out and access traditional lands for specific purposes, harvesting medicine, harvesting moose, or being out on the land and so forth. So we'll see a system that's based off of more alignment with First Nations land use and cultural values, but also where First Nations are leading in regulating that price, regulating that market, and that's a value add for buyers as well from an ESG reporting perspective, to disclose that in your audit and financial statements, that you're working within a portfolio that leverages community interest that's First Nation led. I think that's where we need to go related to the future of that, and to support that average price that eliminates the.
So that's US. $20 at the higher end is typically a nature-based solution. I just got pricing today for a forestry project in China, $13 US, but it is an OTC market. It's pretty heterogeneous based on the underlying, and so it's hard for me to say, what price point a particular corporate will enter the market at. From my perspective, just thinking about the growth of the market and what's needed to scale it, as long as they're in the market, I think that's a net win, because the more that are in the market, the more that's going to drive demand, and then what you should see, depending on how supply responds, is that you should see an uptick in price, bringing more supply online and higher value for those then that already have projects. Again, emphasizing, I guess, that the market still is very, very small. It is purely OTC. You're starting to see some products trade on exchange, but that's probably more of a future thing as the market grows and becomes more liquid.
For people that don't understand what OTC is, can you?
Oh, sorry, transacting bilaterally. So going out and finding a counterparty and entering into a bilateral agreement with them. So for example, in TD's case, when we contracted for the Boreal Wildlands project, we contracted bilaterally, so directly with the Nature Conservancy, as opposed to anonymously, potentially through an exchange, how you'd normally transact a stock or a bond.
Okay, thank you. So you've covered a lot, which is great. But I'm sure there's some thoughts and ideas that you have that I didn't ask in the form of a question. So I'm going to give, starting with Jason, an opportunity to really provide the audience with what other final thoughts or ideas that, in respect to our audience here, that you want to share.
Sure. Yeah, I think the other part of the equation, we talked a lot about the buyer supply side of things, forest tenure, reallocation, and nations looking to develop the long-term land relationship plan, land development plan, and where carbon or nature-based solutions could potentially sit within the community's socioeconomic interests, and planning for that is important. But also the seed funding to get those projects going is where government needs to come to the table to offer these types of projects to advance some of the studies and some of the planning. When it comes to thinking of what could be done as well at a high level, is we see nations planning for the IPCAs, the Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas, and under current criteria, those are ineligible for carbon offset. So having a shift in the mentality to support more of the offset opportunities for IPCAs would would be you know, an easy win for nations to, and for a rising tide for all boats, of course, you know, to see that being supported by government, to see IPCAs be in the carbon offset market opportunity to diversify companies' interests and their investments into a nation's project. You know, the other is what government could do is to guarantee some of the programming in the future related to the market for First Nation-led projects. And if government could guarantee the financing mechanism, we'll see the insurance companies come to the table to also ensure the projects from carbon reversal or those issues. So those are the other two important parts of the equation, is the government and the insurance companies as well, and the lenders, of course.
Thank you. Andrew.
So, you know, I think one of the interesting things about attending sort of a grassroots event like this is you know, the market is growing fast. You guys are by no means behind. Actually, I'm surprised that you know, and kudos to the organizers for putting together an event like this at this particular stage in the market. But I think you're sort of at the upward growth trajectory point in the market. So to the extent then that the carbon markets seem like an appropriate fit for, you know, whatever growth or economic strategy that you have, I think now is a good time to start to consider where offsets might fit into that and what the opportunities are within sort of a broader opportunity suite, and to start to look for partners to help you develop that. There's a ton of material out there. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of firms that are rapidly emerging, again, to capitalize on the space. So a certain amount of due diligence is important as you go out and begin to think about potentially developing projects or partnering with somebody. So I just put that out there. That's natural with any type of rapidly growing market. But overall, you know, again, just within the public domain, there's lots of information then that folks can use to begin to develop a sort of a better understanding of the markets and where they might potentially fit within it. You can start to go out and develop assessments of the lands that you have and what the potential opportunity might be therein. As was mentioned earlier, the federal government is coming out with a forestry protocol. Then it's very, very delayed, so when it's going to be released is TBD, and how commercially applicable it will be is also one to watch. But in the meantime, there are voluntary markets and standards then that you can look at. There's 4 main voluntary standards that most offset projects, ours included, are developed under. So you can begin to get a sense of what the value of an offset project might be. And then again, as that federal standard or protocol emerges, then you can anticipate probably much higher prices, given where the federal carbon price is at and where it's mandated to go. It could make a lot of projects of a lot of different stripes economic very quickly. So,
and of course, our focus is the voluntary market, so that bodes well for everyone in this room. We do have some questions from the audience. You guys okay with taking a couple? I've got them right here. Is there a financing problem for carbon projects as of today?
I'll just hop in and say, yeah, the comments I made around the buyer influencing much of the market is showing that the market today is failing to support or advance First Nation-led projects. And that's where First Nations could have more influence on the market, is pooling supply and potentially piloting projects to show some leadership in there without too much influence from the intermediaries as well. You know, and the other part, you know, to get things going from not just the financing, but I mentioned the grant side of things. Nature United is establishing First Nations or Indigenous programs specifically for Indigenous projects. It was some pro bono work that we did to support them because we've seen a gap in the market that there wasn't necessarily a program that was focused on Indigenous-led projects. So we wanted to develop a financing mechanism to get communities in the door and get their projects in queue and get that thinking going. So that's another area, but there could be more support across Canada for those types of programs as well.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, historically, it's been simple. There's been no money for any projects, and now it's the case that what I'm seeing is more capital looking for projects. So it's kind of flipped on its head. Carbon finance is kind of the base mechanism then that's used for the development of projects where the land, for example, has to be acquired, as was the case with us in the Nature Conservancy. So we prepaid for those offsets, and that allowed them to go out then and acquire the land. I expect that'll be a model that will be replicated. Again, if the lands are already owned and it's just simply a matter of developing the projects, then financing is obviously less of an issue beyond sort of those capital costs to have, bring in consultants and run the project through the different registries and standards and the like. But you're starting to see it mainstreamed. Again, as this market grows, you're starting to see more traditional sources of capital, private equity or banks, that are looking to be involved in the market. And so I think it's certainly, again, historically has been a problem, and it probably, again, depending, could be. But I think it's, as the market matures, it's becoming less of an issue.
Okay. This question is for you, Andrew.
Okay.
Is there a priority for environmental or social license or governance when you talk to buyers?
So it's totally dependent on the buyer, right? Because of the underlying in the carbon offset market is so different from project to project to project. So in the case of an industrial gas destruction project, there isn't a lot of social anything. You incinerate, fluorocarbons, so refrigerants. That really comes into play when you get into nature-based solutions, where that has a role. But I think first and foremost, people are focused on the GHG emissions and to an extent, what is the cost then of that offset that's yielding that reduction. Second then, and it's only slightly lower priority are any sort of social benefits, and that's why you're seeing nature-based solutions really be a priority right now as folks are looking for projects that are, the term is charismatic, that have benefits beyond sequestering the carbon. I think when you have good E and good S, that's a reflection of good G. So good governance tends to yield the first two, broadly speaking. But thinking about offsets, I think focus on the E, followed by closely by the S, and then the G is, again, I think intrinsic to that.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Do we have more?
Can I ask one question as well, please? Thank you very much.
We're going to give you a live mic here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Andrew. Hi, Andrew. You spoke about co-benefits, and I thought that was a great introduction to that. Based on forestry, you spoke on an example of co-benefits on forestry. We have today First Nations represented in the room that are quite significantly nature-based and agricultural, of course, here representing hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural farmland that will be farmed regeneratively, that will be farmed in a way where the biomass index is improving, the biological counts are improving, the land will be farmed in an identity preserved basis where it's recorded, the data will be recorded. So we're selling hard ourselves and our future customers in the OTC that you talk about, our ability to sell these ESG credits, on the fact that the co-benefit is this land will be farmed better. This land will be regenerative, which means that every year it will accretively produce more, which is the real definition of regenerative land. And that really meets the final mission of First Nations, because we simply pass land, they simply pass land on from generation to generation. So co-benefit, speak to other elements of co-benefit that maybe you can speak to. You mentioned a few in forestry. I've just mentioned one in agriculture. Is there anything else that you can speak to that we could put our hands around and help our vision and our mission going forward?
So maybe just touching on ag credits first. The interesting thing about that, it's kind of been rebranded, but in the Alberta system, I'm based in Calgary, and Alberta has had a compliance offset system since 2007, and the single largest source of offsets in that program since inception has been low and no-till, which is now called a nature-based solution or regenerative ag. But as you said, right, it's premised on then changing techniques to improve not only the soil sequestration, but increasing then obviously the carbon content, but water retention, reduced erosion, and the like are other co-benefits, such that over time you should see the soil start to return to maybe how it traditionally was in terms of its ability to support crops. Again, co-benefits. I think the main thing is looking beyond then, in the context of a carbon offsets, looking beyond the GHG reduction or removal. So again, water is a big one. Biodiversity is a big one. I think traditional land uses, like folks are, particularly in Canada, but I think globally, and you heard Fiona from BHP mention that, are looking for ways then to partner with, again, the traditional users of that land as a key co-benefit. And probably that's only emerged in the last 2 to 3 years, but I don't think then the enthusiasm for that and the motivation then of buyers to make sure that that's part and parcel of their project can be underestimated. It is, and people will pay more, right? All else being equal, if you have forestry project A, forestry project B, one has 5 co-benefits, the other has 2. Probably a buyer that's not necessarily price sensitive is going to look towards the one that has more co-benefits, and particularly those that allow partnerships, again, with traditional users of the land.
We do have another question. The mic is, our friends can hear your magnificent question. Oh, we got another one.
Test.
Oh.
Now you're ready.
Hey, yelling around here. Yeah, just a real quick question. I guess just for clarification for those that are fairly new, and looking at, potential projects that are based on forestry versus those projects that might be based on agriculture. Would you maybe be able to share a little bit about the differentiation between how those two are regarded, the difference between them in the market? Either one.
Either one, sure. We'll probably get both of you to answer that.
Want to go first?
Sure. So, again, all else being equal, including price, I think most people would choose the forestry project just simply because of the charisma of it. Oftentimes, companies, then they're buying offsets, particularly if they're making large commitments or long-term commitments, will feature then that project or a description of that project in their ESG or sustainability report. And so even just optically, the picture of a nice rainforest on the west coast looks better than a piece of flat land, even if, from a carbon perspective, it's maybe net is the same. So I would say that, but in terms of, the broader market where maybe cost will play a bit more of a role. Again, as this thing scales, you're going to have buyers that don't care about the price because they don't have a lot of emissions, and then you're going to have people with millions of tons of emissions then that are going to be a little bit more price sensitive or looking to put together a portfolio, some forestry, some industrial reduction, some ag based, where you might see them then be more willing to buy the ag project over the forestry project. But again, looked at purely, I mean, it's global warming, right? So all else being equal, as long as the carbon reduction is the same, one shouldn't care. But just like some people will choose a high-end car versus a regular car, despite them both being modes of transportation, like there's buyer preference in that way. So I guess that's how I'd frame it up right now. But certainly there is a price differentiation in the market right now.
And I think Jason wants to add to that.
Yeah, just wanted to add when I view the forestry projects that are being put forward, a lot of it is looked at as kind of the species that are there, and from a carbon accounting perspective, how those species are potentially contributing to offsetting some of the carbon. Specifically, if I had to think of an area in Northern Ontario with the boreal forests and some of the discussions that are happening from adapting forest management planning to include an indigenous lens or integrating indigenous traditional knowledge in that long-term forest management planning process. If there's opportunities to do that in the agriculture space, to think of how the landscape is considered, how methods of agriculture are being performed, and to include an indigenous lens in that perspective, then there could be more co-benefits, more than just the biodiversity factors that you see a lot of ministries utilize as their key performance indicator. So just you wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, gentlemen, you certainly have provided us with a lot to think about, some great information that we didn't have before. And as you said, this is continuing to evolve. And I think that there's no question that when we look at climate change and the discussion today, I think we're all going to benefit from the learning. So thank you very much. To show our appreciation, I'm going to make sure I don't fall off my stool here. Again, Indigenomics, Carol Ann Hilton, who you're going to hear about later. This is her book. It's a fantastic book on the topic Indigenomics, Indigenous economics. So
thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to turn the mic back to Mr. Lionel Kambeitz.
Thank you very much, Pat. Job well done. Jason and Andrew, fantastic job. Your phone will be ringing. I've got a few more questions for you, so thank you so much. Nice to see experts in the field. Before we break for our networking session, I'd like to call on a good friend and a true champion of the environment, the first person that I ever had a discussion with where he coined the phrase environmental sovereignty. And this was 5 or 6 years ago, and we've challenged each other for the right moment for this to happen and to come, and been a motivating factor in our lives here in seeing First Nations succeed, seeing First Nations empower themselves environmentally and empower themselves with the value of their land, the very lands. Retired Chief Reginald Bellerose. Chief Reginald, prior to just retiring, was a chief for 17 consecutive years, and his family has held positions of chiefdom, I call them positions of being the chief, for over 90 years in this province. He's very well recognized, an outstanding spokesman for the entire arena of economic development in First Nations. I'd like to call on Chief Reg Bellerose.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Greetings, Anine, Danse. Before I start, I just want to ask the chiefs to stand up. There's a lot of this and that. Maybe you don't know who the chiefs are. Can you stand up, chiefs? If you've been a chief or you're a chief, we got Chief Janai over there, Treaty 4. My right-hand man, Chief Francis from Niganit. Yeah, these are the men and women. Chief Woodhouse. Yeah, please. Yeah, so these are the types of, they're not, nobody's Superman or Superwoman. They're just regular people who take on these extraordinary roles. So I just want to, maybe we can give them a round of applause. Maybe the next one we could ask the councillors to stand up. The Facebook warriors, I won't, the whole room won't, no, just kidding. So here's the elected council that work to support the leadership. So when you say government, this is the ones that make up First Nation government. So round of applause for them. Yeah, thank you for attending. You know, part of the opportunity, just share a little bit. So when we were negotiating treaty land entitlement in Saskatchewan, Roland Crow was the chief of FSIN, and he brought in Lloyd Barber, he brought in all these experts. And he looked in a room like this, he said, if I'm the smartest man in this room, we're in big trouble, he said. So, and the point is, you know, the First Nations, they're actually not stakeholders, they're rights holders. They're the first rights holders of this land. I disagree with Bob Ray a little bit that in Treaty 4 we actually don't need the UN Declaration. We have Treaty 4 which protects who we are as Indians, living our way the way we always have, whether it's 4 or 6 or 2 or 10. That's what the treaty is, and Lionel's a partner who's been able to understand the rights that we have through lands, people, all because of our histories. So as we talk about breaking into a market, establishing a market, it's much easier. So if you look at gaming, Bernie Shepherd was chief in White Bear. He had to, face the army coming in and pointing guns and rifles at them so we could get into the gaming market. It wasn't handed to us. Leaders had to take a stand somewhere. And then so you look fast forward 25 years, First Nations owned the entire online market in Saskatchewan for sports and online betting. But it all started way back in White Bear when they faced the assault rifles, trying to say, and them ladies who stood there, all they said is that we want our kids to work. We want our kids to work. Nobody wants welfare in Indian country. We want opportunity, we want education, we want training, all of that good stuff. But what makes it work so well is we bring our rights collectively. Fishing Lake, Daystar, Niganit, Muskaugan. We all have individual rights. But as we come together in collective rights, we become a force. That's how SIGA stands. All 74 First Nations own. The opportunity here is to bring our lands collectively together to stand. Because you're going to hear from TD, thank you for your comments earlier. Everybody is stuck in a provincial or crown. They forget about us. And the reason we have all these rights is not because of Treaty 4, it's because of our inherent rights. Sheldon helped a family, an agriculture family. They went by science. 10,000 years, the science proved we've been here. The ancient cultures of India and China, they have science dating back 5,000 years. So to the ancient cultures, they're just kids to us because we've been here for 10,000 years. So that's how we get all of these rights and privileges and opportunities. And through the AFN run last year, I heard a couple things across the country. One is climate change. We don't need anybody to give us guidance. We need people to listen to us. You in these chairs, people need to listen to you. So what we did here with Carbon is we created 2 functions. One is an Elder Advisory Council. So we're not just going to say, well, we're here because we want to partner with First Nations. No, we want our elders to come in and share their knowledge. That's key. The second thing is we created an advisory council, which would help bring in expertise, influencers from across Canada to help share who are we, what do we want. You heard Jason from Deloitte. He explained it very, very clearly. Everybody is missing the boat. We got to get on the boat, and people like Lionel, he's a good partner. What's going to differentiate Carbon and from other opportunities is the trust. I know what it comes down to. You can have all the decks and the pitch documents you want, but you have to trust. First Nations have to trust who they're going to work with. So we're trying to bring that trust factor to the rooms like this. And we heard from Fiona. Fiona didn't invest in Saskatchewan. Fiona invested in Treaty 4 territory. That's our perspective. Everyone says, well, thank God they came to Saskatchewan. We're like, well, we're happy they came to Treaty 4. That's just different perspectives. It's not controversial or adversarial. It's just the perspective of a First Nation mindset. That's all it is. So I hope no one takes offense to as the leaders and people start to bring forward our vision, what we want. And I learned pretty clearly from a treaty conference we had in Muskowgan. Two things. And a lot of these elders have passed on. One is we need to unite, we need to stand together. And second is we need to make our own laws. Because as nations, we have to make our own laws. Elder Irvin Buffalo, all these elders, a lot of them are gone now. So in this type of venue, those online appreciate you joining and taking an interest. And to the leaders here, I hope we can stand together, because we don't want to just make a show of force in Saskatchewan or Canada. Through our treaty and inherent rights, we have the ability to be international presence, international markets, establish ourselves internationally. But your present demand of I need a home, I need a door, my toilet's broken, all of that, it consumes your time as leaders. Had a lot of those calls myself. Right? I still get heck from people when I see them in the... Remember when I phoned you about my door, you never fixed it? Yeah, that doesn't go away. So during this networking time, I hope we cross over. I hope leaders aren't in this corner and everyone's in that. Let's get together. Let's do some crossover as we chat and share and work together, but also seize opportunity. If you haven't signed, sign. There's one way to do it, and I got myself in a lot of heck over it. I didn't talk implementation. I implemented. Talking and implementing get leaders in a heck of a lot of trouble. But, you know, I'd rather get heck for doing something than get heck for doing nothing. That's how you last in politics. So, simple rule. Thank you for your time, and to the Carbon RX team who helped coordinate, organize. Thank you. It's been a, learning opportunity. Government's here as well. Lots of, Lionel, thanks for everything, and we'll keep plugging away. Have a good rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Chief Reg. Inspiring as always. I can listen to you and have listened to you for many, many years, and I thank you so much for your words of wisdom and inspiration. And it's a great idea. We're networking right now. We're going to break for about a half an hour. We're going to be able to get together and chat with one another, but let's take that advice from the Chief. Let's be sure that every one of our First Nations leaders is surrounded by 6 non-First Nations leaders, getting to know each other, getting their perspectives on what we have to accomplish and what we're going to accomplish moving forward. So with that, we'll take a break, and we'll see you back here at 3:30, and let's make sure we can do a good job of mixing. Thank you very much. Good. All right. Yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt everyone for a minute. We will get started in 5 minutes. So if everybody can take their seats and be ready in 5 minutes, we'll get started again.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll have you take your seats if you would, please. We've got a tremendous lineup in front of us, and I'd like to have you make sure your coffee cups are full and over to your chairs if you would, please. Thank you. I need something. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our next session, and we're going to have another opportunity when this is over to move over to our reception area when this is all done, and we're going to continue with some of this great networking. What a pleasure. I met about 6 of you who I had not spoken to before, and have made some great contacts already, and I watched a lot of you interact and enjoy each other's company. I want to say that last session that Pat chaired, or was the host of, that featured Jason and Andrew, fantastic, and a lot of learnings, and a lot more learnings that will be had from that, from what we heard from that messaging. Next, I'd like to introduce for you via a video presentation, Arina Korchmarov. Arina lives in Boston, and she's the Vice President, North American Vice President for Cotecna. We all know that all this validation and all the carbon credits that we're going to produce agriculturally, forestry, hydrocarbon, methane extraction, methane destruction, mining, all of those need to be tested. Cotecna is one of the top 3 testing firms in the world, with offices all over the world out of Geneva, Switzerland. And they are certainly wanting to take a leadership role in helping us decarbonize. So with that, I really would have us give a warm welcome of applause, even though she'll be on video, to Arina, and she'll give us an opening message. So ready to go. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Arina Korchmarov. Change, it is hard not to notice things are changing. It's the responsibility of each and every one of us to do our part, so together we can make a difference. Many of you will not be yet familiar with Cotecna. In layman terms, we provide testing, inspection, and certification services to businesses and governments. At its core, our work helps make supply chains safer and more efficient. The conference is important to Cotecna because ensuring a positive impact on our planet and society is one of the key principles of our company values. Our commitment to the environment is also a key theme in our sustainability program. It's important to me personally, as I strongly believe that if we associate science and environmental concerns, not just with the school subjects or laboratories or protocols, if we treat it as a way of thinking, our world will become safe and beautiful place to live, work, and raise our children.
Let's get a round of applause for Arina and Cotecna. So thank you, Arina, for providing that for that message and for the support of the Global First Nations Carbon Summit. I'm really excited to announce my panel on environmental sovereignty, and I'm joined by Chief Heidi Cook. If you want to come up, and we'll give you a round of applause. And we're also joined by Sheldon Wuttunee, the CEO of the Saskatchewan First Nation Centre of Excellence. Let's give him a round of applause, please. All right, so I'm very grateful to be joined by my fellow panelists today, and we've had a lot of time to visit and get to know one another. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to say on the topic of environmental sovereignty. It's a topic that we talk a lot about at the organization that I work for, which is Carbon RX, and I'm the manager of business developments. And I'm happy to be your moderator today. Awesome. All right, so I've just given a brief introduction of both of you, but Chief Heidi, do you want to explain to our audience in person and online your role as Chief of Misipawistik?
Sure. Is my mic on? I don't think it's on.
Oh, I think you're good now.
Am I on? I go set.
Good.
There we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank the chiefs and councillors, the elders of Treaty 4 first for welcoming me. I come from Treaty 5 territory at the end of the Saskatchewan where it enters Lake Winnipeg. And my other name is Kananatawapit. And in the language is Cree, so you guys probably understand Kananatuhuapit. We don't have that word in our Cree, but that's who I am. And I've been chief for 2 years, and before that I was a counselor for 6. And the reason why I decided to run for chief is, just an extension of the work I started in the lands department. And for me, rebuilding traditional governance systems expressed in a modern way is, kind of where I nerd out. That's where, I get excited about the work. And we started that in our lands department when we started building a Indigenous Guardians program, or we call them Kanawainistigewak. And we had a number of management issues in our territory with overfishing, overhunting, and forestry clear-cutting. And our guardians have been able to address all 3 of those in a really good way based on the traditional laws that our people were given when we were given this as our home at Misipawistik. And, we have been very effective in seeing change, not based on enforcement of any laws, but on education and encouraging compliance. And this is actually a culmination of a lot of the work we did. I call this our constitution because at the center is Minopimatisiwin. And that's the reason why we do everything, is to make sure we have a good life and a good life for our children. And in this design, there's a lot of the values that our elders told us were important, that we need to make sure that we teach our children so that we can have a good life. And that's what we build our land laws on. That's what we're now working on for other areas of our governance. Our CFS, our health, our education, those kind of things. And I realize now I'm starting to go on too much, and I was just supposed to introduce myself. I'm sorry.
You started answering all my questions. That's not fair. Trying to write new ones now.
Sorry.
Sheldon, can you take a few minutes to explain your role as a CEO and some of the goals that you had set when you took the position?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sheldon Wuttunee. I'm from Red Pheasant Cree Nation, south of North Battleford here. I'm a Cree as well. My traditional name is Biesukanipoet, which is Standing Thunderbird in our language, and certainly a name that I carry and gravitate to, in my professional and personal life. You know, and our Center of Excellence here in Saskatchewan is a unique organization that I'm very proud to be able to represent and be a part of. We have a board of directors, which Chief Bellerose is one of our board of directors as well for the Touchwood Agency Tribal Council. And, you know, we have an appointment from each of our tribal councils across the province, as well as our independent First Nations, and also the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. So it's a great organization that provides opportunity for engagement, but also accountability back to our 74 First Nations here, to environmental or impact assessments, to business development, really across the spectrum. And we're very proud to have this organization within the province. And you know, we certainly encourage other provinces to step up and support something similar. And sometimes it's difficult to you know, bring everybody's perspectives into the fold, but it's certainly something that we all need to work towards. And when we're looking at environment, sustainability, as you mentioned, you know, our traditional laws, our natural laws, as we talk to, those are very important and guide our decisions as First Nations people. And I always share, in my experience as chief, and I guess bringing that to the center, when we engage with industry or we engage with government and we're seeking opportunity, the question often that comes back is, well, what capacity do you have? And we kind of know, but we don't always fully know. And it's very important that as we engage, as we work together, as we collaborate, that we look at that from a technical perspective, capacity a lot of times. But now the globe is starting to recognize and understand that as First Nations people and our ties to Mother Earth and the Creator and our relationships to animals and plants and those types of things, we have immense capacity. And it was shared before. We don't always need advice. We need to give advice, and it needs to be listened to across the globe. And we're starting to face a lot of those prophecies and ideals that our elders have shared with us for many, many years. So I'll leave it there for now. I'll certainly share more on that because it's a very important perspective as we do move forward in this clean energy space, carbon credit space, and looking at environmental sovereignty and what that means.
Thank you, Sheldon. Chief Heidi, do you maybe want to cover for those that might not know what our natural laws are? I'm thinking about some that are, you know, not Indigenous, maybe watching from home or watching overseas. Do you maybe want to touch on some of the things that we as Indigenous people just inherently believe in terms of our natural laws?
Well, you know, in Grand Rapids, we had first contact in 1738, I think it was, or 42. So when I was growing up, and even when my parents and grandparents were growing up, it was there was no ceremonies, but our people were still very strong in identity and teachings of the Cree. So I know that a lot of the, you know, there's certain teachings that go along with the ceremony. But when we did our own work here at home, we asked our elders, what are the important things that you were taught when you were growing up about how to give a good life? So that's why this is what we came up with, eh? Mm-hmm. And respect was one of the most important things. You know, you have respect for other people, but also respect, like Wuttunee is not just our family, but it's our all the trees, the lake, you know, all the animals. Those are all our relations. So our relationship to our home, mm-hmm. and all the living things that make up part of it is part of us too, right? And we always have to respect all of those relationships. That's one of the most important things, and that's what surrounds this entire design. And then the other, you know, Bob Ray talked about love. He surprised me too. But you know, yeah. I really believe that that is important value that we have to use to solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing, because I don't think that just burning fossil fuels is the problem. I think that greed is the problem, and that love can be the solution for a lot of that, right? So it's just a different way of looking at some of the problems. Let me cheat here and look down here. To have courage, right? The right thing is not always the easiest thing to do, but that courage comes from love as well, and to be honest in your words and your actions and those kind of things, right?
Yeah,
Those
absolutely.
are the traditional laws or the natural laws. Even Wuttunee, like, I think of climate change in that way as well, right? Like, because we're not respecting the earth, and that's coming back. It's going to make things harder for our children, so we have to try and address it.
Thank you. Sheldon, anything that you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I mean, I come from teachings, I guess, from my mom, for the most part. And she's an old schooler about individual sovereignty as it relates to collective sovereignty. And I think even furthermore, environmental sovereignty, and I go back to one teaching or learning over the years, is that we can't live without plants, animals, and water, but they can all live without us. And I think that's a real important reminder for us as the human race, is that as the traditional natural laws are shared, that decisions that we make are going to impact and affect the future generations. And I know our leadership and our elders, we're all told that by our people and our elders. And then I always share this as well, because as our traditions, when we go to Sweat or we go to Sundance or whatever the case may be, us as individuals, sometimes we're provided with gifts or things to carry on to take care of our people. And there's responsibilities that come along with those. And there's messages, there's stories, there's teachings. And with that in mind, and how we're going to impact the future, when our leadership engage or deal with a project, deal with industry, with government, they carry that in every decision that they make. And we talk about reconciliation, and the reconciliation, and leadership has to reconcile with themselves and the Creator in a spiritual world in what decisions that they're going to make for the future, because we have to answer for those. And as Indian people, that's drilled right into us from day one. And when we look at environmental sovereignty and what we have, I guess, practical control over in terms of our reserve lands, the question will be, how do we implement our laws, as a government, as a nation that relies on our traditional or natural laws into the greater population, meaning off-reserve, treaty, and traditional territories? How is that going to be respected by municipalities, provincial government regulatory regimes, federal government regulatory regimes? When is it going to make that meaningful impact that we're at the forefront? This opportunity, this carbon offset piece provides an opportunity, I think, to move that marker. It provides an opportunity for us to participate in a conservation initiative on a global scale. There will be hopefully some economic return on that, but I think a lot of it is intrinsic value, that we are able to walk a little closer to our traditional or natural laws to walk that good line. But again, we don't have control over the global market of it, which obviously leads to a bit of skepticism. But for each of us that are going to be involved, the due diligence and understanding what that means and how that relates to us as a person or as a nation, that's going to be the important piece moving forward. So
Thank you for that, Sheldon. Actually, I want to continue with you. You've already started leading into it, but How do you think the carbon economy is going to impact First Nations? You already started to talk about it. Can you just add a bit more? Would you like to go, Chief Heidi, if you're ready?
He wants to copy what I say.
He gets the easy job, right? He just gets to add. He doesn't have to set the foundation.
Well, I have to be honest. I was never a fan of carbon credits. I saw it as giving a license to pollute, but I'm also, especially since I've been a chief, I've had to become a bit more pragmatic in how I approach development, and I think of it as, we've been working for a long time at protecting our lands, because when our lands are protected, then we're protected our language, our culture, all those things, right? And there is this necessity, because climate change is such an urgent crisis, that and the reality of the way the economic system is, there has to be some way of starting to account for pollution if you're going to use that economic system to try and address it. And carbon credits is one of those ways, right?
Yep.
So, if there's going to be a benefit from the work we're doing, then we need to get that benefit. And I don't see it as, a be-all and end-all, but where we're going, it's a step to where we're going. Because I would like to see a more fundamental change, but I have to be satisfied with taking the steps and never losing sight of that end goal. Same with, a lot of the work that we do. We've been taking that approach just so that we don't get stuck where we're at. So I feel like, a lot of the First Nations will be in the same place as us, because we have lands that are still rich, and that, that traditional ownership, like the treaties mention logging, but they don't mention carbon, so we retain that, right? That's ours to claim. And we should take every opportunity we can to try and rebuild our economies and rebuild our prosperity, so that we can, reach where we're trying to go. So I hope that, that this is something that is going to turn out really well for First Nations.
Very well said. Thank you, Chief Heidi.
100%.
Yeah.
Are we done now? No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, I'll switch it up. Do you have something?
Yeah, I
okay.
like that. I just,
Sure.
just further to my question earlier, I think, it's going to be important, for us as First Nations to ensure that we have the opportunity to undertake our due diligence and have the capacity to do that as individual nations and collectively. Obviously it's a market that's based on, aggregates or collectivity in some regard. But just my question earlier is, the different approaches from a forestry-based project to an agricultural-based project are two totally separate opportunities. And I think understanding that, and as we move along this continuum or along this journey, I'll say, this is going to impact globally. But as First Nations, we're not necessarily provided, as was mentioned earlier by Jason, I think, seed funding to be able to ensure that we have capacity. It's difficulty finding seed funding for nations now for lands management and things like that. And this carbon is it's an add-on onto the already burden on staff at the band level. So it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of investment at the forefront. But if it's as valuable as everybody is saying it is, then the feds in the province need to step up and ensure that our First Nations are well versed and they're able to make decisions on their own 2 feet. We're in UNDRIP times now, and I think it's time to get serious about it in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheldon.
Yep.
Okay, so another question that I am posing to the group here. Our title of our conference is behind this idea of Indigenomics. Have you both heard it before? Chief Heidi's. Okay. Yeah. Sheldon, have you heard it before?
Yeah.
Okay. Can both of you maybe spend just a moment just kind of explaining what that idea means to you? So from my understanding, it's a traditional worldview and an access to a modern economy as a right of an Indigenous people. So that's my understanding of it. Sheldon, do you have a different understanding?
I got this one. No. I don't think it strays too far from that. I think, you know, I go back to, I guess, my experience over the years with the center and being a chief. I think, you know, Indigenomics is, you know, how does this economic development, you know, this push for economic development fit into our worldview? Because I think we're continuously being asked to fit our worldview into an economic space, which provides its own, how would I say it, like, it's foreign in a lot of regards. You know, when we go to our elders and talk to them about land and taking up of land or resources, it's tough conversation to have over things that I mentioned earlier. So it's very delicate, but at the same time, regulations, policies, legislation, they're all, you know, especially over the last 50 years, have really undermined that type of conversation to have an impact in terms of our traditional ways. We're finding that to change a bit now. And I think with, you know, things like MMIW, National Truth and Reconciliation, our voices are starting to be heard more. And we need to invest as a country in Indigenous-led projects, Indigenous-owned. Like, equity has to be the minimum now. We just have to go down that road. If our companies are proposing a couple jobs and, you know, maybe a contract or two, you know, on a project now, that has to be yesteryear. Because what happens is our nations, they take a keen focus and put time and effort to building partnerships, and really valuable and good partnerships. But the end goal is to make sure there's opportunity for those partnerships on the other side of the table. Yep. And I think when we're looking at Indigenomics, that's a big part of it, is ensuring that we're creating, I know we all want to say level playing field, but we need priority in our treaty and traditional areas. That's what we need as First Nations people, because then we can get to a level playing field. But we've undergone, and we've heard all the stories just last week, like, we've gone through a lot as First Nations people. And we were put on reserves. There's a permit system put in place to marginalize us from the economic table. You know, we were able to get a couple jobs to pick rocks and pick beets and potatoes. And when you look at a massive project, uranium, potash, we don't want to be the rock pickers or the potato pickers. We want to be the owners. So I know that's pretty straightforward, but I just think that's the way we got to go. In Indigenomics, that's how I feel it is, that we're owning, and we're getting pretty adept now as First Nations in what we do. So, thank you.
Anything to add, Chief Heidi?
Sure. I should have read up on the background of the term, but because I haven't read the book,
I'll solve that for you in just a minute.
I might get a copy after this. But when I look at it, I think of you know, like, there's this trend of indigenizing and that kind of thing, and it's like putting things, looking at these concepts through a different worldview. And if you're looking at economics, Indigenomics, you know, there's more than one bottom line, right? There's the social bottom line, the economic, the environmental bottom line. And I'm not sure if that's what it is, but that's like kind of the understanding I get from it. Because I think that the Indigenous worldview, you know, around the world, they have these common threads that are very valuable when it comes to addressing big problems like climate change. And it's a different way of looking at the world, and it's a different way of looking at solutions. And that when these worldviews are given, you know, a platform to be shared, when people take them seriously and start incorporating them into different governance systems, that we can create solutions that are more sustainable. And I think that Indigenous knowledge is a gift that we have to share with the world, and that, you know, a lot of the profile of different justice issues, you know, are raising that awareness. You know, after I worked at home for 10 years, I went to do a master's in development practice, working on sustainable development goals and such. I got, you know, I was on the honor roll and all these things because the knowledge that was shared with me by my elders was so cutting edge in academia.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, it's just common sense to me. But, you know, I feel like that's where, you know, the direction where we need to go, and not having just these, you know, silos, but to have that Indigenous knowledge that ties everything together.
Exactly. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Any closing thoughts that you want to share with the group, Sheldon?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for being here. I also want to thank Chief Reg for his dedication to, you know, as he mentioned earlier, you know, we gotta push the marker a lot of times, us as First Nations, and sometimes it seems like it's in your face a bit. We try to be as diplomatic as possible, but you know, as been shared up here and through the day, we've been entrusted with our Mother Earth for the future, and we stand by and see a massive economic engine, I'll say, creating $1 billion of capital and revenue that we don't get. And we see it happening down our highways, in our fields, in the mines, and it is billions and billions of dollars. And our First Nations are still administrating poverty a lot of times. So we want to change that. And when we look at environmental sovereignty more specifically, we have a reserve system in Canada, although we have a greater responsibility to our treaty and traditional territories. But that environmental sovereignty has to be looked at that lens, not just the reserve, from us and the greater population, because we have enormous impacts on our reserves from environmental impacts that happen off our reserve, and we're left to deal with those. A lot of times it's water, a lot of times it's just access to animals or what have you. But you know, water, some of our reserves, you can't drink the water, but we see billions of dollars of revenue going to the feds and the province from a mine that should fix the water quality for us. It's a human right. So there's lots of that stuff that we can talk about. I won't go down that road, but they're very important to mention, because as you leave here and move on to what kind of change can I make, it's certainly being aware of those issues. And economic development is seen as a key to that, to raising the quality of life for us in a practical sense. But we always weigh that with our traditional and natural law way of life, because that's always going to be paramount, because that's our spiritual relationship. So I'll leave my comments there. I thank everybody for being here, but I exceptionally want to thank the leadership that are here to support our elders, and you as well as the greater community. It's important conversations for us to continue on. So appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you, Sheldon. Chief Heidi. I agree.
think, yeah, I agree. No, I feel really grateful to be here and to be part of this conversation and to see so many non-First Nation partners willing to come and listen and learn and, you know, how to do business and to, you know, work together to lift our communities up because, you know, recognizing the sovereign rights that we have as First Nations, the title to the territories, not just the reserves, you know, like our reserve is so small. It's probably over half muskeg, but we're talking, I want to thank Matt too, for the Director of Forestry for Manitoba, for coming out here. We're going to talk about carbon credits in our entire traditional area because, you know, like that's where we need to go. We've proven ourselves to the province that we have more effective ways of managing resources, that we have the capacity to do so, and you know, we've done that with help from other outside partners, you know, and we're not done. We're going to keep on going, you know, until our kids don't have to have a moldy bedroom and, you know, like 15 people are not inside a 3-bedroom house. We need to have a good life for our children, to know that they're valued. I need my kids to grow up and have clean drinking water and to have clean air, you know. My daughter, she, okay, never mind. I'm going to start telling another 20-minute story. And I don't think we have that long. But that's, you know, like, that's who we need to do it for. And it's not 7 generations from now. It's the generation that's here right now, you know, like that is the urgency of these things. So let's get on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can I get a round of applause for my panel, please? All right, so I'm going to solve your problem, Chief Heidi. Thank you so much for coming and participating. I really appreciated your words. Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you. There you go.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Wonderful.
Appreciate
Thanks, you
it.
guys.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
It's great.
We're good? All right. Sorry, gang. Sorry about that. We're improvising a little bit here on the transition through the AV there. Sorry for the impact. And I'll maybe buy us a little bit of time here as we load in our next speaker. We did some draws. Some of you, when you entered, put your name in a bucket to win a copy of the Indigenomics book. And so I'm going to call your name out, and maybe after we can have you just come up to the front as the conference wraps up, and we'll present you with the book at that time. It'll also give you a chance to meet Carol Ann in person. So the first winner is Jerry Christian. Jerry here. All right. Thank you, Jerry. Anna Ballantyne. All right. Oh, we got a fan. Thanks, Anna. Dean McDonald. Is Dean still here?
Oh, Dean's book is going to someone else. Abelina, are you still here? Oh, Abelina's outside there. Don't go too far, Abelina. You have a book coming your way. Abelina is one of our guests who came in from Northern Ontario, so thanks so much, Abelina. And this name, if I don't get it right, please forgive me. Tamika Panay? All right, Tamika. All right, congratulations. And Dallas Robinson. Dallas? Okay, all right, awesome, Dallas. So thank you guys for putting your name in, and I hope you enjoyed the book too. I think it's a great read. And we're just I'm going to give my AV guy a little bit of permission here to change the screen. Our next speaker, Caroline Hilton, had an opportunity to put a few slides together literally 5 minutes ago, and so my AV friend here is going to get things loaded up. But I want to introduce Caroline. We had a chance to connect, I don't know, maybe it's probably 6 weeks ago, and Kristy, who you just saw on stage, said, I think we have a great keynote here who can really set the stage on Indigenomics and really round out the theme of our conference. So I'm humbled to be able to introduce you to Caroline here today. And Caroline is the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute and the Global Center of Indigenomics. She is the Wuttunee descendant from the Hisquoa Nation in Vancouver Island. And she wrote this book on Indigenomics. And if it's not a bestseller yet, I think it will be by the end of this conference because it's in the hands of many, many people here. But I was asking Caroline before she came in about, feel free to come on up, Caroline. But I was asking her any interesting travel, and she's got a speaking event she's doing in Costa Rica soon. And her book has really put Canadians, First Nations, and Indigenomics, on the menu in a lot of conferences. And so I think that's something she can be proud of. And I think all of us in the room can definitely be grateful that she could make space for us here today. Her theme is that we're really in a power moment here as a First Nations community, and I want to give her the stage here to allow her to build off of that soundbite of that we are in a power moment. So, Caroline, please join us.
Good. Perfect.
Yeah, actually, let's set it up, and then our viewers at home. We're just going to do a minor podium adjustment.
Perfect. That's what they do for the short people, I guess. Thank you for the warm welcome and the introduction and the invitation to come and spend time with you today. Uklasish Caroline Hilton, Heshquiak Supsish Uklas, Wakatushkoatsa Umti. That might be the first time our Nuu-chah-nulth language is spoken in these territories. So I come from the west coast, Vancouver Island of the Nuu-chah-nulth people. My Nuu-chah-nulth name is Wakatush, which means I come from a line of the oldest woman. I'm very excited and absolutely said yes when I heard that this gathering was going on. A lot of my work in Indigenomics is about centering our leadership in the space that we're taking up, in the space that we're creating in the Indigenous economy. So I wanted to focus on that concept of radical inclusion in the low carbon economy and the place in the space that we are building and how formative that has been in terms of our ability to participate, where we've come from, and really essentially bringing focus into this power moment. Some of you may have heard of the concept of Indigenomics, and some of you that may be a new concept, although it seems to have gone around the country and around the world several times. So it's exciting to see the uptake of it and the positivity that it's built on. So I essentially describe Indigenomics as the collective economic response to the lasting legacy of the systemic exclusion of the Indigenous peoples in the development of this country. That is the truth in the space that we have to be able to build from. That uncomfortable space of that realization. You might ask, well, what does that have to do with carbon? What does it have to do with carbon? To actually understand and to be able to look at this concept of Indigenomics by design. Indigenomics is essentially a design platform. It's about designing the experience of our exclusion and designing our future It's coming to the truths of that experience and beginning to build the foundation of what does Indigenous economic power look like today. To be able to bring focus and light and truth to that concept of the structure of radical exclusion before we come to the position of radical inclusion. So I essentially posit that Indigenous economies, prior in our whole state, prior to contact or that disruption, was the first stage that we were experienced upon arrival. Looking at this stage specifically, the systemic disruption of existing Indigenous economic systems, our ways of being, and removal from the land, while severing our inherent authority and responsibility to place. This stage in itself required in that stage was entanglement. This stage is essentially characterized by the complexity of the entanglement of the Indigenous relationship, locally, nationally, and internationally. This is firmly embedded within the conflicts stemming from the disruption of our Indigenous ways of being, our epistemologies, and the threat to our continued way of life. It is in this entanglement the complexity of the emergence was firmly established. This third stage, characterized by the emergence of the Indigenous legal environment. This legal context essentially serves to reinforce new, modern economic space for Indigenous nations, businesses, and governments. It is essentially what I describe is that what happens in the legal environment is expressed within our economies. To understand that is essentially, formatively, also what brought us together today. To understand what has shaped the legal forces has allowed us this new space and new opportunity and new relationships. And finally, empowerment. To realize that this stage is characterized by the rise of Indigenous economic empowerment as an effect of the shifting Indigenous rights and titles legal environment, economic equality, and inclusion. This stage essentially sees an increase in Indigenous business development and economic activity as a viable and competitive business model. My work at the national level has essentially been that Indigenous peoples need to get off the cost side of the balance sheet of this country and into the investment of actual economic power. To understand and build focus into this concept of Indian Act economics, it is specifically in this context that this conversation is convoluted within. To understand as a premise that Indigenous peoples were systematically legislated out of the mainstream economy, that the Indians, as it's still referred to in the Indian Act, were systematically uninvited to the economic table. And while the Indian Act was and continues to be a primary tool to serve Indigenous economic exclusion, remaining the sole tool for the continued economic regression of the Indigenous peoples. Again, you might ask, what does this have to do with carbon? It is in this economic space that essentially our ability to bring focus into this concept of the space that we are creating. So moving through these essential concepts of phases that we've gone through, landing that we are in a power moment, to be able to understand and to bring into focus the concept of economic space, the space of what has happened to us, and the creative dimension of establishing our identity, our ways of being, our worldview into economies and coming in as key players that are fundamental to this discussion. But to be able to build specifically within this power center of the Indigenous economy, it is essential to understand and be able to uphold the concept of recognition, the experience of that, the structure of that, and the process of that. The expression of rights and title, representation, which tables that we sit at, which tables we have never been invited into, as well as the resources. Looking at this quadrant of essentially the space of Indigenous economic power, it comes to our attention that this formative moment is largely shaped by that concept within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And while essentially what is described is the right to an economy, it is also equally important to understand, particularly in this context, that building on that formative truth, Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the economic table. That second to that, Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to fight for a right to an economy. Now, coming into focus, to be able to understand and bring a discussion specifically around what is the opportunity for Indigenous leadership in the low-carbon economy. I look to a number of specific examples where we are seeing exemplary, demonstrative, clear, tangible pathways of Indigenous leadership. We look to the concept or the structure of the First Nations Climate Initiative, a collection of 4 nations in a particular hot zone that looking at essentially providing leadership on climate and development policies that are impacting with the foundation of using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Why is this significant? To have a nation-based, nation-led policy framework that pushes for energy development that meets local and global climate change targets and reduces poverty in Indigenous communities. To look at that specifically from an LNG perspective, the framework essentially supports the concept of building the infrastructure and innovation for the foundation of a low-carbon economy moving towards 2050. Again, the larger context specifically here, resources do not leave Indigenous territories without Indigenous peoples at the table. To be able to bring into focus, and again, to understand that essentially, when we move this into a carbon focus, the opportunity is essentially the structure of Indigenous economy, the big why, the big how. So not only were Indigenous peoples legislated out of the actual economic table, but to understand the perpetuation of that it facilitates the big why, the how, and essentially what we are doing in building the economies and the big purpose behind that. To essentially establish a policy framework in itself is about developing an investment plan that realizes this vision. The second example that I draw upon, I'm not sure if we have anyone here from Indigenous Clean Energy, which I think is an absolutely amazing work and organization. Again, looking at this as a particular structure. Collaborative, community-driven clean energy futures, respecting Indigenous lands, treaties, and rights, and enriches their communities. Essentially, clean energy partnerships play a critical role in a low-carbon transition. These are elemental entrance points to be able to understand this emerging narrative. Indigenous partnerships are key to meeting Canada's climate commitments. Again, when we put this specifically within a carbon context, it's building the essential foundation of Indigenous leadership, particularly around the inclusion of energy futures in our economy, positive, meaningful collaboration, and essentially the value chain of how that has shifted. All of that has occurred largely because of our insertion that we are still here, we have rights, we must be recognized, and essentially operating from that place that we are a powerful people. I particularly like this concept of the Indigenous space in a low-carbon economy, which begins to demonstrate and break down the actual economic participation and space of Indigenous people. And well, essentially, my work at the Institute has been facilitating the structure and design of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. For clean energy, you realize the space for infrastructure, you realize the space for carbons, particularly within that focus. So realizing as the economic driver that essentially to pay attention to the shift that is happening of Indigenous economic power. The realization that emerging numbers, Indigenous communities are the third largest owners of clean energy in Canada. That Indigenous communities are leading the way on renewable energy, and that essentially the spaces that we have created for ourselves are following much within the carbon context and our ability to facilitate the structure of our own inclusion. To look at the concept of the structures of Indigenous inclusion, we look at two examples of specifically looking at the shifting dimensions of ownership, co-ownership, increased economic benefits, royalty agreements, Indigenous financing, revenue sharing, lease agreements, impact benefit, or partnership agreements, to essentially understand that the carbon context in this country has essentially shifted, that the ability to invest into partnerships and ownership is significantly adapted from what the partnership or the program intention was originally set out to do. We have grown bigger than the programs of regional and national design. To understand that also demonstrates the PowerPoint that we are in, that our ability to facilitate this concept of emerging economic strength. It's in this space that the ability to align the growth of clean energy projects, the growth of structures of Indigenous economy are essential to pay attention to. One of the best examples of an early demonstration of Indigenous leadership in terms of carbon particularly is anyone familiar with the Great Bear Rainforest out of British Columbia? They essentially negotiated one of the early carbon structures with 80% revenue that essentially established a circular economy where the ability to facilitate through those revenue, the carbon revenues, the ability to facilitate actual processes of Indigenous-led conservation, Indigenous management and risk management within the territories, and the ability to facilitate ownership within that structure. As an early demonstration and mover within the carbon markets, essentially, I think it's essential to be able to liken emerging economic strength to the powers, to the structures and the processes of Indigenous ownership, the access to markets, the access to investment. Again, our ability to bring into focus what is the features or characteristics of this power moment. The realization of essentially having Indigenous people at the table, the value of Indigenous investment, the structures of Indigenous ownership, and essentially facilitating the space of Indigenous visibility within this conversation. How quickly has that shifted? It shifted in our lifetime, and it's shifted within the mandates that essentially describe and establish the Indigenous position within the overall economy. To bring back into focus the concept of ESG, we are seeing that a significant shift of Indigenous inclusion in the concept itself, where the normality of ESGI in itself is establishing the normal, where the requirement of risk, the requirement of impact, and the requirement of outcomes is shifting into the financial and accountability dimension. Again, to put this in the context of the carbon markets, Indigenous inclusion, Indigenous strategic partnership, the structured economic inclusion. It is in this space that our ability to understand the outcomes that we are creating, that it must shift the lived realities of our people to a positive. That essentially this space is about building understanding of the importance of the Indigenous relationship. And finally, what is in front of us? What are we looking at that is the progressive action for economic inclusion? When we look to examples such as Carbon RX, we understand in essentially facilitating to bring the key players, to bring key perspectives, and to be able to facilitate the space of what is next, what are we leading, what is important to us, and what is the opportunity. To do that, we must be able to talk about that essentially the concept that Indigenous peoples have been excluded. To bring into focus the places, the tables, the policies that shape Indigenous inclusion today. That is essentially Indigenomics. To be able to understand the outcomes that essentially, what is the impact of the lived reality, the possibility of continuation of language and culture, the continuation of care for elders or space for youth, the ability to understand and realize that how significantly, even within a 5-year context, how the carbon market has shifted, how the nature of Indigenous inclusion has shifted, and essentially to be able to bring together the conversations that bring into focus essentially what it is that brings us here today. So in saying that, I wanted to refer directly to the leadership that has allowed these initial structures to be possible, to be able to acknowledge that essentially our place to bring leadership into focus, to have a voice of what we value, and to bring structure to economy in a new way is the opportunity that is in front of us. Again, I wanted to thank the organizers for putting this together, for being able to bring into focus the leadership, the conversations, the projects, and the investment environment, particularly to identify what is the shift and ability to bring into focus why we're here today. We do have some time for question and answers, and I'm happy to take any before we end. You have the mic?
Can I borrow the mic while I ask the question? Yeah, I can bring this one forward. Sorry. I'm interested as you've campaigned this topic around the country and talked to audiences wherever, where's it landing with the most impact? Or which audiences maybe are struck by to take the most action? It's kind of a two-part question.
I think my work is about what I call educating the capital. For example, just before the Truth and Reconciliation Day, I had the honor of doing a keynote address with the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. And I think to understand and build a narrative around the importance of adjusting the perception of the Indigenous, able to bring a demonstratable concept of this is what we're looking at in terms of Indigenous economic strength. Absolutely the financial sector. I think absolutely the policy tables to begin to look at how to adapt policy to support investing into Indigenous economic design. The absence of design is largely what the concept of Indigenomics has responded to. Even in my work at the federal level, the realization of federal programs that could be cut at any time, that didn't have an end outcome, that was reflected to Indigenous economic measurements is a lot of what my work has been focused on.
Thank you so much. No, I don't have a question. I'm very appreciative, Caroline, for you to come in and spend some time with us today, and certainly bring home the idea of Indigenomics in terms of what we're doing, and I'm really grateful that you covered those things during your presentation. I have a gift for you because I wasn't going to give you your own book signed. What? So I have here a ribbon skirt for you, and I'm not sure if this is something that you wear in your traditional lands, but this is something that's really sacred to us in Treaty 4 territory. And my friend Angel Whitestar actually made this, and she's from Pipot First Nation. And I really just wanted you to have something that you'll remember us by. So I'm gifting this ribbon skirt to you, and I hope that you'll enjoy it and you'll take it with you to ceremonies and share that.
Thank you.
There you
So
go.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Show the group. And that's kind of your colors, right? Like black and white?
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Caroline. Okay, I'm going to call on my partner here, Lionel, to come and join me just for some wrap-up comments. Come up and do a closing prayer. But firstly, maybe I'll start with a couple of things that I took away from today. My first one was kind of coming out of the panel, this idea that Jason seated with me, that we have to work together to do this. This idea that we're running in our own lane and we're going to get here to net zero or even participating in the carbon economy, it just doesn't make sense. And I think Jason did a really good job of hitting on that. Lionel?
Tremendous. Sheldon, Sheldon did an amazing job for me in terms of the understanding, making sure we understand the relationship between the economics of what we're trying to accomplish and the natural law. Realize that we won't be successful on a long-term sustainable basis if we don't really understand that and move that through together. This is a long race. Net zero. The economic benefit's going to move right up to 2050 from now until then. So the opportunity to do this within the natural law and make sure that it prevails is going to be very important to have the longevity and the longevity of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and we opened with BHP telling us that not only was it 2050, but it's 2030, and companies making statements and holding themselves to account to hit those targets.
Well, it is, and it's a new moment for us, and we recognize it when we listen to our speakers as well, that governments will have to change policies along the way. The social political fabric and the moment of the day, as it was in September of 2008, when the last time the carbon economy was parked. It was parked due to the global financial crisis. Governments will have to park priorities. But these 1,500 to 2,000 companies that have committed to 2050, the largest Fortune companies in the world have committed to this. This prevails. We have to prevail here past the policies of government as we find that they will again vary. But in the case of these companies are committed to being net zero. And we are one of the tools for that. And one of the things that we have to also, Marty, we have to talk to a little bit, and it was one of the guests that I spoke to at the break told me this. We have to understand that this new carbon economy, the new voluntary carbon economy we're creating, is also a tool for innovation. We really don't know how we're going to sequester. There's sequestering technologies available tomorrow that we can't define today. We have to be able to identify those quickly, make sure that their contribution is recognized, and make sure that they become a contributing part of what we're doing. So we will have new technologies year after year that are going to help us solve the climate change problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and I think my last thought was what Caroline shared, and I have to read my note. Indigenous people are critical to Canada's net zero. We cannot get there without the involvement of First Nations people in Canada. And so I want to leave that as my last thought and my last takeaway from today.
I'm going to have two last takeaways, Marty, if I may. One of them, I think Andrew had spoke to, and I spoke to it a bit, and it really awakened something in me that we have to focus more on the co-benefits of what we do Every action has a reaction. If that reaction is a co-benefit, let's identify that co-benefit moving through. There are a series of co-benefits. We can identify them as contributing to social license, or we can identify them as an economic co-benefit, or a social co-benefit, or a co-benefit that brings us more in line with the natural laws that we're trying to follow. So I think we have to really think more inclusively about co-benefits when we move ahead. I think that's really an important aspect. And I'm going to close in saying that I believe no single force in North America will be more powerful than our ability to consolidate all of the First Nations lands in this country and move on a path towards developing and creating higher value for the carbon mitigation that's going on, the carbon sequestration, and the contribution to the new carbon economy here by First Nations. This will be the single most powerful force underneath that umbrella, and its contributions moving forward will be immense and beyond our ability, I think, to even identify it today. So I want to thank everybody. Martin, I want to thank you for putting on a tremendous show and effort and your thoughts and your ability to be the flexibility and to bring people together. You've brought a great team together, and I look forward to watching you be very successful as you are the key driver with all the passion to be able to drive this forward as well. So thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Lionel. And I'd like to thank you. And thanks everyone for coming too. I'm quite humbled by the participation and engagement we had today. And Elder Woodhouse, would you give us your final thoughts, final blessing?
Let's just sit here.
You know, and it's been a great afternoon. Now we understand the needs and steps we have to take to get there. And just to a few moments of your time, what I gained is, speaking from like Bellerose, Chief Bellerose was talking about protecting our land, the treaties that was signed in 1871 in my community from Treaty 2. In matter of fact, just for you to know, my great-grandfather signed our treaties in our community in 1871. I really honor what he signed that time to protect the land on Treaty 2 area. And I think that's just, like Chief Bellerose was saying, this is still there that the people who don't want to move forward from the Treaty 1 to 11 because they honor their treaty land, their land that they're living in. So I think what we need to do is looking at is to do more presentations. Like this meeting here this afternoon brings a lot of understanding how we can move forward. Where I'm coming from is from the First Nation. Like we mentioned about one of the chiefs was saying, they're still dealing with broken doorknobs or doors or whatever. I did that when I became chief in 18 years. We made progress, so we built houses. First of all, I focus on housing so I can accommodate the needs at that moment. But after a while, the last few years, I was focusing on the economic part. So we moved on that, and we have that opportunity to move that direction as First Nation people. We don't have to lose our treaties. We don't have to lose our land. But being involved like this, there's an opportunity, there's a potential that there regarding economic development. Because the reason for that, our people went through so much, like what was said this afternoon. Look at residential school. Look at the child welfare. The little ones, innocent people that we lost in this country. This still affects our First Nation people. That's why we're very cautious to move forward. But putting a strong foundation, meaning presentations to be open to each other, but the leadership has a role in every community. Once they bring this experience to their table, they have to present that to the grassroots people, meaning the community. So they get an okay, a green light from there to move on. That's how it works in a community. It's because we're, as a leader, as a chief, the chiefs are responsible for they're working for the grassroots people. It's not, the membership are here, the leadership are over here. That's how it is, and that's how I understand it all the years that I was there. But, this is what, it's a good afternoon. I gain a lot from this. What I'll take back to the province of Manitoba, like Chief from Cook and Sheldon, they did a good presentation where they came from, what the needs are in every community. So we have an opportunity that we can move that direction. It's just time that we need together to, in every community, in every organization in a First Nation land. That's all we need to do is to educate. We know we have a lot of young people that are educated today. They're graduating in areas like environmental, like what Chief Cook was saying. We have more of those people that'll come to take part of what is discussed here today, and they'll take a role in the days to come. So with that said, I'm really happy, I'm really honored to be here. And also I'd like to thank Mark for invitation and to take part of it's well organized afternoon. Miigwech, and thank you. And with all the presenters, but let's all stand and we'll close off with a prayer. I'd like to thank the Lord for this good afternoon. Thank you, Lord, for this afternoon that we come finishing off our meeting, our discussions, how we can move forward, Lord, to work together. Well, that's what you want from us, Lord, to work in unity, to understand each other, to move forward. Without that, Lord, it'll be difficult. But bless everyone that's here, Lord, the chiefs, the counselors, the presenters, the company, RX, Carbon RX, Lord, the staff. Bless everyone, Lord. Keep everyone in safe travels. We're asking you for safe travels on the road, as there are many animals crossing the road at night. So keep everyone safe, Lord, and we thank you for a good, precious day discussion this afternoon, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Elder Woodhouse. Thank you. Okay, I welcome you guys to hang around and visit for a little bit. Those of you that want a book, if you want to come up and see us at the front, and then please join us on the other side. There's a bit of food over there and some drinks as well.